Fault Lines.
And we're live, coming to you from across the divided states of America. The most disruptive show in American politics. In the politically independent corner, I am your investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And here we are, live, coming back to you. All right. As we do every morning 3 times, we have headlines. We do these once at 7, once at 8, and once at 9 a.m. Eastern. After this first batch of headlines, we go straight into Jamarl's monologue. And after that, we're taking calls. So if you want to call, you can. 202-521-1320 is the number. That'll be in about 15 minutes. But again, 202-521-1320. Jot that down if you'd like to. All right. In the news, first headline this morning. The Justice Department yesterday on Monday labeled 3 cities anarchy jurisdictions. Those cities are New York City, Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. The Democratic mayors in those cities have largely opposed federal intervention despite rising crime rates, referencing their desire to not escalate tensions. This is a quote here from Attorney General William Barr. When state and local leaders impede their own law enforcement officers and agencies from doing their jobs, it endangers innocent citizens who deserve to be protected, including those who are trying to peacefully assemble and protest. Again, that's Attorney General William Barr in his statement on Monday. In a joint statement, the mayors of the 3 cities said that the order was, quote, thoroughly political and unconstitutional, end quote, and accused the president of, quote, playing cheap political games with congressionally directed funds, end quote. I just want to say, I have not yet seen a clear answer of exactly how much of the funds that the federal government provides to these cities is being sort of held out on a stick here. I'm not sure what's being held back. We can get into that in Jamarl if you know. I'd love to hear, but I just haven't seen that. Anyway, next headline. NASA has formally outlined a $28 billion plan to return to the moon by 2024. As part of a program called Artemis, NASA proposes sending a man and a woman to the moon's surface in the first manned landing since 1972. The agency's timeline will be contingent on Congress releasing $3.2 billion for building a landing system. Astronauts will travel in an Apollo-like capsule called Orion that will launch on a powerful rocket called SLS. Speaking on Monday afternoon, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said the $28 billion, this is a quote, the $28 billion represents the costs associated for the next 4 years in the Artemis program to land on the moon. SLS funding, Orion funding, the human landing system, and of course the spacesuits, all of those things that are part of the Artemis program are included, end quote. $28 billion, not that much money to get to the moon. I mean, it's a bunch of money in the scheme of things, but, extraterrestrial spacefaring species, if we were to become that, $28 billion would be a pretty small price tag. Anyway, next headline. The body of Ruth Bader Ginsburg will lie in repose at the U.S. Supreme Court tomorrow and Wednesday. She will be buried in Arlington National Cemetery next to her late husband. And in my next headline, Beijing has reportedly rejected the deal with Oracle and Walmart. This is the TikTok deal, with the editor-in-chief of China's Global Times newspaper tweeting that Beijing won't approve the current agreement because, quote, the agreement would endanger China's national security, interests, and dignity, end quote. Global Times later posted an opinion piece rejecting only one seat for the current CEO, the current head of ByteDance. And Oracle would be able to inspect the source code of TikTok, code which is reportedly shared in part or whole, it's kind of unknown which, with the version of the app used in China, Julian. I'll admit, I was a dummy here. TikTok is the sort of international version. There is another version of the app, basically the same app that's used in China at home, called Douyin. Just interesting there. Did not know that. Next headline: British tabloid The Daily Mirror reported this Sunday that the Attorney General, I'm a little bit late to come to this story, but hey, better late than never, that the Attorney General for the U.S. Virgin Islands has demanded logs for Jeffrey Epstein's 4 helicopters and 3 planes from 1998 until his suicide last August. These logs would include the names and contact details of anyone who worked for the pilots, or of anyone who, quote unquote, interacted with or observed Epstein or any passengers aboard flights on his airborne vehicles, but also include any, quote, complaints or reports of potentially suspicious conduct, end quote. I'm sure there are many, I don't know how many complaints or reports there were, just because, people can keep their lips sealed about things. I'm sure that there were many chances to observe potentially suspicious conduct, as they're putting it. In 2009, pilot David Rogers provided logs in 2009 showing Prince Andrew, Bill Clinton, Kevin Spacey, and Naomi Campbell were among those aboard Epstein's Lolita Express. Lawyers for the victims said that the 2009 logs did not include flights made by chief pilot Larry Visosky, who flew for Epstein for more than 25 years, and a legal source for the Mirror, which is, again, the source of this article, they got it as an exclusive, reportedly told them that, quote, the records that have been subpoenaed will make the ones Rogers provided look like a Post-it note, end quote. We'll see about that. In Britain, Prime Minister Boris Johnson is expected to announce new coronavirus restrictions later on today, ordering pubs and restaurants to close at 10 p.m. and telling workers to, quote, stay at home if you can, end quote. Pubs and other venues are expected to be allowed to serve seated customers only, and drinkers will be prevented from gathering in crowds. This follows an order from Johnson earlier this year in July in which he urged staff to, quote, get back to work if you can, end quote. Minister for the Cabinet Office, Michael Gove, confirmed the move this morning. And my last headline for this morning, or at least for the 7 a.m. hour, a prominent critic of Xi Jinping was arrested and sentenced to 18 years in prison on corruption charges. After years spent criticizing the CCP and Xi Jinping, starting as a blogger on the platform Weibo, a Beijing court announced that it had found Ren Zhiqiang guilty of embezzling public funds and taking bribes totaling $2.9 million. This American dollars, by the way. He was detained in March and removed from the Communist Party in June for, quote, smearing the party and country's image, end quote, and, quote, being disloyal and dishonest with the party, end quote. The trial reportedly lasted 1 day. In its announcement of its ruling on Tuesday, a Beijing court said Ren accepted his 18-year sentence and would not appeal. And those are my headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. So, Jamarl, what's on your mind today, man?
So I have an interesting aside in order to kind of make this work. If you guys are ever looking for a really good sci-fi show, Supernatural, I cannot recommend it enough. In one of the storylines, Dean Winchester sells his soul to hell in order to protect his brother's life. They tried for 1 year to prevent it, and after 1 year, when they can't prevent it, Dean Winchester has his body ripped into by hellhounds, invisible hellhounds, and he is dragged to hell, where the show ends on that particular note with him screaming with his body in chains for help. Now, what ends up happening is Dean stays in hell for 40 years. And after 40 years, he's dragged out of hell. Now, you don't entirely understand why at first, but what you realize is that after a certain period of time, Dean breaks. And when Dean breaks in hell, he gets up and he starts torturing other souls. Meaning, a demon offers him a deal. If you get up and torture other souls, Dean Winchester, we will let you go. Meaning, as long as you are willing to do this, you're free. Dean, after 30 years, breaks down, gets up, and starts doing the job that other demons did to him for those years. Crying and telling Sam that he couldn't take it anymore. Sammy, I just broke down. Now, he finds out later that his dad had been tortured for 100 years and didn't break, which also added to a certain degree of terror for one Dean Winchester. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I want to kind of point out some of the vagaries of our current society, dealing with things like evictions, or for that matter, food banks, the pandemic, meaning illness and everything else. But let's go to the evictions part for a moment. Right now, there's a company called Level. Level is saying that they are basically the Uber for evictions. And I'm going to read this. This is from Vice. A company called Civil says evicting people is the fastest growing money-making gig due to COVID-19. Since COVID-19, many Americans fell behind in all aspects, reads the website copy. The button below this statement is not for a GoFundMe or for a petition of calling for rent relief. Instead, it is the following call to action from a company called Civil: be hired as an eviction crew. During the time of great economic and general hardship, Civil aims to be essentially Uber, but for evicting people, seizing upon the pandemic-driven nosedive in unemployment and a huge uptick in people who can't pay their rent, Civil aims to make it easy for landlords to hire process servers and eviction agents as gig workers. Yeah, that's right. People who fall behind and can't pay their rent, who themselves are at risk for being evicted. I think there are like 40 million people who are supposed to be at risk for being evicted. 30% of people didn't pay their rents in April, August, etc. And so this company is basically saying, hey, you want to stop yourself from being evicted? Come join us and help evict other people from their houses. You're basically the poor helping evict the other poor. It's on Craigslist. It posted across the country. Civil explains the opportunity plainly. There is plenty of work due to the dismal economy. Unemployment is at record high and many cannot simply are not paying rent and mortgages, the ad states. We are being contracted by frustrated property owners and banks to secure foreclosed residential properties. The gig economy for evictions. When I make the point that your social contract is broken down, right here, your society that's supposed to have some level of a social contract, that's supposed to at some point, on some level, believe that if things started to break down or things started to fall apart, that government would step in. Because after all, you pay your taxes into that government. You give your votes to that government for political leaders to go out and do X or to do Y. And you, at the very least, expect in an emergency for them to do those things. That's not what's happening. And you have private enterprise, just like the company we had on the other day where they're like, hey, we can now take advantage of these kids and make videos out of them. Shane said it jokingly, but the guy acknowledged, yeah, that is one of our plans to do that. I'm sorry, this is sad. I can't even be mad at them because for them, it's a rational act to try to take advantage of them in this particular economy, regardless of how morally disgusting that is. Ultimately, they are going to go out and they'll say, hey, we have all of this gig work using our app. And this app, kind of like Uber does for taxis, basically allows property owners and whatnot to say, hey, we'll give you this much for this particular work because we need to get this person out of this house. And by doing that, by the way, can cut the price of even those services. People complain that there was apparently a charge in order to use it, which I find to be awesome. People are getting on an app in order to take advantage of the fact that people can't afford to pay their rent and can't afford to basically live because they've lost their job. Misfortune. And they find out, hey, these guys are trying to take advantage of me with this $35 charge. Look, your society can be different. And unfortunately, if this is incentivized, then somebody will take advantage, as this app is choosing to do so. But you have to ask the question about a social contract and whether or not you actually believe in such a thing and whether or not your government is fulfilling the obligations of that. And if not, why not? Is there some responsibility for your political leaders to attend to your needs? And I'm not necessarily saying this for all the time, but I am making the point that during a crisis, you would think that the vendor of last resort, the government itself that you pay your taxes into and that you give your allegiance to and that you allow sovereign force to beat you up and to kill you at times, that these guys are not living up to their responsibilities. And your question is, what do you do about it? And is there a political solution to this problem, any of these problems that avail your country? And are your political parties even paying attention to this? My answer to you is no, they're not. The question for you is, why not? This is disgusting. And yet, this is incentivized by our economic and political system. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Quick note, we are taking calls. You should call us. 202-521-1320 is the number you can call if you want to call a number. Again, 202-521-1320. I'm sure you have a phone, and I hope you know how to use it. But if you do, we're here, and we're ready to talk when you are. Anyway, no, I'm just kidding. Jamarl, your monologue, I'm going to come back on this. I'm gonna take an opportunity to recite the last stanza of this short poem that I like by this guy named Philip Larkin. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. It's pretty abysmal. It's not. I would not recommend following that poem in its heart or its creed or its spirit or anything like that. But the first part about man handing misery onto man, I think he's talking generationally
He's
there.
dead on. Yeah.
He references a coastal shelf. It kind of reminded me, or what you were talking about kind of reminded me of that. You're talking about, by the way, you shouldn't, Jamarl, you're plot spoiling, bro. Supernatural. You've done this with me, but with True Blood before. Come on.
I'm sorry. It's so good, but it's going for like 10 seasons. 14 seasons. So it's been on forever.
Oh, man. I
had
no idea.
But it's such a good show.
It's been a pop cultural phenomenon for a long time. I just was not aware it'd been around that long. So I guess I can't blame you for that. That's kind of
it's such a good show. They go into the issue of God, demons, all that stuff. But that's what this made me think of. It really did.
Totally.
Look, I want to boo-hoo these people, but if you are out of a job and you are struggling, and maybe you're already driving Uber, and you need to add this on. If it's between your wife and kids not having food versus doing this, you do this. You know what I mean? It's just disgusting that this is what we allow in our society. This is the level to which we've gotten to, where, like you said, man handing misery on the man. But after all, none of this is an act of God. All of this is, for the most part, acts of policy. And even to the degree of people being evicted. And that's massively unfortunate. This company, an opportunity opened, and the company jumped on it. Can you poo-poo the company at this point?
Yeah. Yes. You just did, and I think that's meritorious. I think it's worth kind of criticizing them on their own grounds. You can criticize the system too. To shed light on the situation, to open the blinds real quick. This kind of thing, has been going on for a long time.
Yes,
it's the gig economy aspect of this. It's the nature of that weird kind of new work where you don't have any stability. You're kind of matched up with people anonymously on a constant basis, and it's not like you have an employer or something. That's part of the overlay that might change how people see this. I was reading through that Vice article, and I think pretty much anybody who hears about this most people are gonna deplore it in some sense, especially during the crisis. The basic assumption here is that a lot of the people being evicted are being evicted because through no fault of their own, they've lost their jobs through the pandemic. So I think that it's not in some sense that reality has gotten worse. This is a good take if you want to be optimistic about humanity. It's not that reality has gotten worse. It's that our standards have gotten higher. And isn't that kind of good? Isn't that a kind of good thing for us? What's your take, Jamarl?
But our standards haven't gotten higher because this thing exists, and this thing, I would wager, is going to do very well. Think of Uber for the moment. When I was in Kenya, Uber was in Kenya, And Uber, apparently the king's son got into a relationship with the company. And so because of that relationship, they were able to keep wages extremely low. So if you got into an Uber in Kenya, you're paying like dollars if you're paying that much. I don't even think you're paying that much because of the relationship that they had. This basically, of course, screwed over the Uber drivers who were at many points protesting the fact that this was taking place. If you were in France, there were protests also against Uber drivers, where these guys, I think, were having a hard time even if they were caught at the airport. Like, it undermines one business, but it's great for people who are basically consumers. Well, that's the same thing with us. This thing exists, and the fact that this thing exists, and yeah, we may criticize it, but criticizing as we will, it will exist and it will make profit. So our criticism, who cares? At the end of the day, if they're making profit, they make a profit. That's the point of the company. I don't know if the poo-pooing is enough. That's what I'm saying, Shane. The fact that it exists. Like, if our standards had evolved as a society, this wouldn't happen. And that
it would not exist.
Right.
I hear you. No, I hear you. And and there have been strains of discontent throughout millennia. As long as there's been a human, I would think there's been another human
right.
who was criticizing what that first human was doing.
Right.
I mean,
right.
within civilization, of course, you get oppression that builds up. You get these structures that build up. That's thousands of years old. So I don't want to act like our rejection of this kind of thing is new. Humans are always human. We always have our ethical center. I mean, okay, so this is where people's mind go. What do you do about it? What do you think you do about it, Jamarl?
You don't let your society get to the point where people are that desperate. That's what you do about it. Like, this is policy. This is not an act of God. That's my point. Like, when you have 42% of your society that's making $18,000 a year. Now, I've lived in a world where we're making that much, with a parent making that much, or for myself for a while making that much. I'm telling you, that is a hellish world. Your anything is a crisis. If you get a parking ticket, that's a crisis. And 42% of your society, that's nearly half of your society. And by the way, that's poverty from the government's level. That's not poverty in real terms. That is higher than that number. Well, then you get a crisis of a pandemic that makes it worse. I'm saying you don't let your society get to that point. You don't have wealth distributed in a way where 95% of the income gains go to the top 1%. You are asking for a crisis if you allow something like that. That's my point. Now, whatever you need to do to make that not be that way is the way you need to go, in the direction you need to go. I would say worker co-ops is one of those ways, meaning getting rid of this notion of CEOs necessarily being like kings and queens. That would be a start, but you would need to find ways to ensure that people who are not necessarily entirely on the top are getting the resources and basically the fruits of their labor. And if you don't do that, nothing else matters. That's my perspective on it. I mean, am I wrong? What do you think about it?
I think we should be doing a lot more, but I also feel like global productivity, like for all that the world appears to be doing great in terms of the amount of dollars floating around, global productivity has been, in terms of the rate of growth, in a slump for like 50 years. So I haven't talked about this too much on the air, but we talked about it a little bit when I first came on, but this idea of manufacturing, the idea that back in the 60s, 70s, you had in America a sort of manufacturing base that promoted technological innovation, promoted R&D. It meant that the working class and impoverished people had a chance to get out of that position because you had genuine productivity at home. And over time, it's become first the services economy and then sort of the intellectual economy. And now it's like the gig economy or the IP economy, whichever way you want to look at it. My point being there, IP is closest to R&D. IP there is closest to technological growth, which, as far as I can tell, is the real source of, genuine productivity. Right. Here's where I'm going with this. This might seem like it's coming out of left field, but I feel like there's like been a malaise that's been getting stronger for decades now. And I think part of what that has to do with is that if you don't have something to hope for, if you don't think that the future is going to be better than the past,
yes,
then you're not as likely to work for that future. You're a lot more likely to get depressed. You're a lot less likely to have kids. You're a lot less likely to save for your retirement or invest in things or start businesses or start social ventures. If you don't see a way out of the problem,
you're talking about on a higher level.
Stuck in a rut.
You're talking about a higher level.
About on that high level.
Right.
Yeah.
Like as a society itself.
Not just down.
Right. Not like as a society.
Trickle down culture or something like this or something. The decision, the material structural components of that society are seriously going to affect people's psychology.
Yes.
And I think we've been living through that.
I agree. 1,000% agree. But the catch becomes, what is that organizing principle? I mean, is that we're going to another planet? Is that we're going to Mars? Is that we're going to the moon? Is that we're building a space station where all of the countries of the world are going to come together under this banner and all of these jobs are going to be created in those industries? Like, what is that? I mean, if you told people that they were working for some higher cause in their society, whatever that cause was, let's say getting rid of food deserts, and you build a corps, and this corps is called the Elimination of Food Desert Corps, and their job is to go out and to eliminate food deserts by building these automated food processors. Would those people have a sense of pride in what they were doing? Yes, I would think so. And if you extrapolate that to NASA, if you extrapolate that to doing some other thing that's getting rid of some other societal ill, I think you would have that. I mean, the catch becomes the job has to have some level of decency and worth to the job that the person is going to have to care about doing it. But you could do it, but you can't do that, I don't think, from a private sector. Does that make sense? Like if you had, for example, the Job Corps, where they had a very specific mandate to go out and do something very specific, and that we, as a country, pay them to do that service. I don't know how you do that in a private way. But am I wrong in that?
I think there are elements in which you can. I just don't think it can be only the only private industry. I mean, unless you're going to have an entirely socialized or an entirely capitalist economy, you're going to need to have some like give and take on both ends.
Right.
For instance, just to push back slightly, for all that we criticize him, for all that I could criticize him, for instance, about his most recent comments about Bolivia and the coup and stuff, even though there might have been another layer to that, something tongue-in-cheek or revelatory or dissident. Elon Musk. A lot of people have been inspired by Elon Musk.
Right.
And as far as I can tell, he's doing a lot of the things that he set out to do. Now, he's getting government subsidies, and libertarians will push back on that. And he's a capitalist who, again, buys lithium from Bolivia, which was cooed by the U.S.
Right.
A lot of people on the left will push back on that. There's sides of this. But I'm just saying there are examples. There are ways in which this can come from private industry. But frankly, I think at the end of the day, I don't know. There are going to be a bunch of false starts where we have some leaders who are offering some visions. You're talking about a vision, and that's not going to work. I think it's just a matter of getting it to actually work. It's like a chicken and an egg problem. Do you need leadership or do you need a vision? Well, in some sense, they're kind of joined at the hip. You need somebody who has that vision or some group of people who have that vision to do it. But you also, of course, they need to have that thing.
But let's be clear. That only works if people are made whole. Like that vision stuff doesn't work if people are fighting for their needs. Like that's what I mean. You can get these big ideas. Like you can get people to look at climate change. You can get people to look at social ills. Once they themselves are made whole and they are complete and they're not struggling for their needs. Meaning, if instead of you having 18% of the, 42% of the population making 80,000, you had anti-poverty measures like they had in China that went through trying to eliminate poverty in the country till you get to the point where there's a much, much higher middle class and poverty is eliminated. Like, then you can get this kind of higher perspective of, hey, yeah, let's do something about climate. Or let's do something about going to another planet. Let's go to the moon. Let's go to the Mars. You can get that stuff. But you have to ensure people are made whole first. It's not, it's a policy issue. It's a, you need X before you get Y.
I hear you. All right. Wait, Jamarl, if you're down with it, let's go to Tarif from New Orleans. We got a minute or two. Yeah, Tarif, you're on. What's on your mind, Tarif?
Yeah. Hi. How y'all doing? Good morning. The solutions is inside the human race to deal with these solutions, and thank God for the internet that it's people in Africa and throughout the world is learning. I called in today to talk about the situation I'm going through dealing with my tooth in healthcare, and I have to come up with money that I don't have, and thank God I had good credit to take out a loan just to get my tooth fixed, and it's going to be over, $1,000, it seemed like. And, single payer, to me, is not communism. It would give people a better chance of surviving and easing their pain. Dealing with dental, eyes, ears, throat, and surgeries and other things like that. And so we do need a system where we take care of ourselves here. And maybe one day spread it out through the world by developing Africa and Southeast Asia, Central and South America. And also, I like to say that by me being a whistleblower, I also like to testify in front of the Congress and Senate. Can't really go to the VA, even though I have VA insurance, because my name was smeared there. And when I go down, the employees don't look down at me. The see me as like not one of them anymore.
If you blow the whistle, they're not going to like that. That's the thing. And I mean, good on you for doing it. You talked about dirty water in the pipes at one of these facilities. Tarif, we've got to go to a break. I'm sorry to hear about the tooth, man. I'm sorry to hear about the cost there. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be back in a second.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7.
My ROM is not picking up yet.
Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Hi, yes, I assumed
back.
no
You're
cameras, yes?
Fault Lines
Sorry.
with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined now by Maram Sousli, also known as Syrian Girl, Partisan Girl. He's a political commentator and geopolitical analyst. By the way, you can follow Maram on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl, spelled exactly like you'd expect it, Partisan Girl. You can also find her on YouTube by searching for Syrian Girl Partisan. And last but foremost, I suppose, you can support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Syrian Girl. That's the most important thing. Maram, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Good, thanks. How are you guys doing?
Good. Yeah, good. Better for having you here. All right. We wanted to get into a kind of heady conversation about the history of Lebanon and the history of Syria. And we turn to you. You are our Syrian expert, and you're also one of our top Lebanese experts in terms of, the regional politics there. Talked before about sectarian politics in the region. And in the state of Lebanon. We also just want to, in light of like the massive political conflict going on in that country, we wanted to kind of get a little bit deeper into the history here, maybe setting people up for understanding some of the conflicts in the modern state of Lebanon. I also, back when it was Lee and Garland on the show, I believe I remember hearing you talk at one point about the religious divides and how a lot of people in the West assume that there is a deep Sunni-Shia divide and that is the divide, essentially, that is the one divide. From what I've heard you say, that might not be quite as true. That might be used as a sort of cover for deeper geopolitical interests that the states have. It's not that there's, a necessary enmity between Sunnis and Shiites. It's that's been used, that's been trumpeted up. I might be getting that wrong. No, I might be misremembering, or I might have misinterpreted. What's your take on that? Just starting there for a sec.
Well, most certainly you're correct. In terms of Lebanon, it's a lot more complicated than just Sunnis and Shias. So in Lebanon, there's Christians, Sunnis, Shias, Druze, and there's also two different sects of Christianity. So there's the Maronites, which are more like Catholics, and the Orthodox. So there's two sects of Christianity, there's two sects of Islam, Sunni and Shia, and there's also a third religion called Druze, the Druze religion. So there's 5 different parties, and you could probably add more. So if we want to go back just to the history of the region, especially the Levant, just before World War I, it was all under the Ottoman Empire, and the region of the Levant, they basically thought of themselves as all Syrian. So when people from Lebanon or Syria would immigrate to New York, for example, if you looked at the photos of, Syrians in New York in the early 1900s, you would see all of them would just call themselves Syrian. There wasn't a designation of Lebanese or even Palestinian. They were all just Syrian because they were from the Near East and specifically the region of the Levant. And we all speak pretty much the same dialect of Arabic. And it had Aramaic influences, Aramaic letters and pronunciations that make it unique to the Middle East, because there are still regions in the Levant that speak Aramaic, which was our historical language before the Arab invasion brought the Arabic language. So, and that's going too far back. So, just to sum it up, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Syria declared independence in 1920, and the country was supposed to encompass all of Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. That was supposed to be what Syria is. But that Syria, a few months after declaring independence, was invaded by France and Britain and carved up. And the French, we know what happened with the British section, Palestine. They carved it up into a Jewish section and from Jews from Europe, and didn't leave much for the Palestinians. But for this slicing and dicing was also happening in Syria. And the French, they ruled by divide and conquer. So they would see that this area has Christians in it, this area has Druze in it, this area has Shiites and Alawites in it, and this area has Sunnis in it, and they would like to carve out mini statelets that really can't survive on their own without outside support, but using sectarian lines to cause these ethnic divisions. Now, it didn't work. But the vast majority of Syria, it did not work because people fought the French occupation and united the country back together piece by piece. The unfortunate thing is it did work for Lebanon. And that is because, actually the Lebanese themselves in that region were split. Not all of them wanted the creation of Lebanon. This was really not that long ago. It was like 60, 70 years ago now. And they thought that it's ridiculous because it's basically Damascus and Beirut are 2 hours drive apart, and people have family in just across the border. It's like they by drawing that border, they've divided families into two different countries. Suddenly we were all one country. Suddenly we're two countries. So not everybody was for it, and who was for it and who was against it was actually sectarian. The Orthodox Christians, the Sunnis, and the Shiites were all against dividing up Syria and creating Lebanon. But the sect, which was the dominant sect in the region at the time, the Maronite sect, was pro-creating Lebanon. Now, the interesting thing is 70-odd years later, the Maronite sect is no longer the majority. Now they have a plurality there, and other sects have also increased in numbers. Not only that, but there are now millions of Syrian refugees living in Lebanon. So the border between Syria and Lebanon is just theoretical at this point. And both countries are basically historically linked in such a way that eventually they're probably going to come back together as one anyway. Although there are people, especially amongst the Maronite sect, that will be very resistant to that. And they're very much tied to the French. These are the people that you will see, not all of them, of course, I'm generalizing, but these are the people that you will see celebrating as Macron comes into Beirut. And they are pro-Israel, and they are against Hezbollah. But the rest of the country, except for perhaps some Sunnis, are pro-Hezbollah and pro-Iran and pro-Syria. And therein lies the division that is being stirred up right now by people like Rick Grenell, who is the head of intelligence there in the United States, trying to push like the influence of Hezbollah out of Lebanon. Because at the end of the day, this is about weakening Hezbollah so that Israel can reoccupy Lebanon. That has been Israel's plan all along. They've tried it in 2006 and they failed. They try it every 10 years or so. They give it, or 15, they give it another go, and then they get pushed out. And if the idea is to create economic weakness and chaos and violence, potentially a civil war, in order to weaken Hezbollah.
Maram, let me ask you this. Could you give us an understanding to the American audience what Hezbollah is? Because oftentimes when they're depicted in the U.S. media, it's basically a terrorist organization. But that's not what they are from the standpoint of Lebanon, correct?
Well, they are a party in the government that was elected. So obviously not a terrorist organization as you have in the United States. And in fact, in Europe, they are also not seen as a terrorist organization. I mean, not like most countries do not list Hezbollah as a terrorist organization because they're not out there killing like civilians like Al-Qaeda or ISIS and blowing things up. No, they're specifically a militia designated to resist Israeli occupation of Lebanon. There's nothing outside of that. And everything else, you hear about them is just purely propaganda. They cannot be compared to like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. In fact, they fought Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. And they defended churches. So it's like comparing night and day. And the only reason they're listing them as a terrorist organization is because they resist Israel. And as we know, the Israeli lobby in the United States is very powerful.
Maram, one other interesting side of this, you mentioned the Maronites. Two quick questions, actually. Where did the Druze fit into this? Where did the Druze fit into ideas about Lebanese political independence and specifically integration with Syria? And also, why were the Maronites, at least formerly, the sole religious group to have taken that side of things, Maram?
I think because of the Catholic Church. They were very, very connected to the Catholic Church, whereas Orthodox Christianity remained very Eastern. The Maronite sect was more influenced by the West. And of course, if we look at it more, practically, I'm sure they thought that they would, everyone wants to be the king of their own hill. And if they're promised to be the king of a little tiny country led by their sect, that's basically what they wanted, even if it means cutting up families and dividing them and things like that. It's just about control and power and money. And that's what the French promised them. And that's what they continue to want to remain, hold on to, in spite of the fact that the demographics has shifted so dramatically. Sorry, I forgot your other question.
The Druze. No, thank you. That was a great answer, Maram. Yeah. The Druze, exactly. How do they fit into all this?
Well, the Druze are actually split. What people have to understand about the Druze is that patriotism, nationalism is actually in their religion. So the Druze of Syria, for example, are extremely nationalistic to Syria. The Druze of Lebanon, it depends on who their religious leader is. So if their religious leader, Jumblat is a very Zionist individual, probably not his father, but the young Jumblat is. And he, it depends on, they're split down the middle. Some of them are pro-Syria and some of them are pro-Israel. And those that are pro-Israel actually are connected to the Druze in Israel, who, in spite of the fact that Israel doesn't even recognize them as citizens, have been convinced to defend the Israeli state because of these religious leaders of theirs.
Let's do this. Let's take a break, and we'll come back with Maram Sousli, political commentator and geopolitical analyst. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We're joined with Maram Sousli, political commentator and geopolitical analyst. Maram, we've been talking about the formation of Lebanon and how that has basically been shaped, let's say, by foreign forces, especially after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. I want to get into Hezbollah specifically and the formation of it. How did that organically take place? And not just organically take place, the politics around its formation and keeping it formed in regards to the task that it was performing.
Well, interestingly, it formed in the 80s and around the time of the civil war in Lebanon. During that time, every sect had its own militia, basically, unfortunately. And alliances formed between different sects, but basically, like some sects had two militias. So it formed during that time, and it evolved into the sphere of Iran and Syria. Essentially, because it's a Shiite militia, it's influenced by Iran, which uses it as a staging point to attack, the Israelis, which are a Zionist threat. They are expansionist, and they are a threat to Iran. But also the Syrians have influence inside Hezbollah, and they too have, because of the secular influence of Syria, it kind of made Hezbollah also a secular militia, and they actually have Christian members now as well. So the point, I guess, is that it started off as a sect of, a militia of a sect, and morphed into a joint Syrian-Iranian operation against Israel. And there's many militias that are fighting Israel. For example, the SNP. It's just that Hezbollah just happens to be the most successful resistance group because of the Iranian support. Of course, there are other resistance groups. There's Amal, there's SNP, as I said, there's the PFLP, etc., but they just happen to be the most successful.
So despite being a secular group, they're still popular from the standpoint of the country itself.
Yes, indeed, because they have, in spite of being initially a militia of one sect, which is Shia Islam, they have morphed into a nationalist militia, which also has a section of Christian members, and they have wide support amongst the Orthodox Christians in Lebanon. Maybe not Maronites, but Orthodox Christians in Lebanon. So it's become what it initially was for that Shia cause. Now it's just a nationalist cause, and that is why it has wide support. And actually, in the constitution of Lebanon, it's the mandated resistance organization. So that you cannot disarm Hezbollah under the constitution of Lebanon. You cannot, because they are needed for the protection of the border, because Israel is always trying to invade. And of course, it's not the only resistance group, as I said, but it is the most successful one because of Iranian support and training.
That last bit actually might be the most crucial thing for Americans to understand, that they are a paramilitary group in that sense. They're working with the government effectively, like you're saying.
They are the government, indeed.
Yes. No, that's thank you for the correction there. As a part of the government, they're working with the government as a sort of as a political party and a military group, specifically to guard Lebanon's southern border with Israel. That's just, again, I'm just sort of highlighting that fact. For Americans, if you view them as a terrorist group, I think it would be a bit counterintuitive to realize, hey, they're part of the Syrian government. They're military. They are effectively a part of the Lebanese military in some sense. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. There are paramilitary group that it has, and Hezbollah has actually a position in parliament. So not only is it mandated by the constitution and their they're, as you said, it's part of the military and government. And you know what? If you want to get around it in your mind, I guess, the general Soleimani, he was a general in the Iranian military, and yet the U.S. media could somehow claim to call him a terrorist.
Yeah.
Makes absolutely no sense. But I guess that's exceptionalism for you.
Unfortunately,
it is. Yeah. Well, and it's also, I mean, terrorist has become the boogeyman. I mean, I'm sure it's like following the decline of the Soviet Union, the United States needed an enemy, and terrorists became that enemy. And then over the last couple of years, it's sort of segued from terrorism to generic authoritarianism, which in a weird way is on the opposite end of the political spectrum. With terrorists, you lack state power. You're sort of an insurgent in a state, whereas with an authoritarian, it's another way of looking at this is the United States enmity shifting from sub-national powers to national powers, going up head-to-head against Russia and China in the modern era.
It's interesting because instead of fighting Al-Qaeda, they began supporting Al-Qaeda, taking over Libya and Syria. And then they started calling the state the terrorists. The Iranian military became the terrorists rather than Al-Qaeda, which they were funding in Syria. It's funny how they can just flip narratives like that and people don't notice.
Well, it's also demeaning.
Because I guess...
right. I mean, it's demeaning also. Like, if you're engaging somebody who you're considering, let's say, an enemy combatant, at the very least, you're engaging them as a military. You're acknowledging that this group is a soldier of some other government or something. The moment that you're calling soldiers terrorists, you've basically demeaned the soldier into something that is, less than what you would consider to be somebody who's an equal enemy combatant. The language, you're right. The language flips, and the language is used to demean. That's my point.
And I think because of ISIS giving such an ugly face to Muslims, even the Muslims that fought ISIS have it's easy to label them as terrorists now because of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which in 2011 was, under Obama, we weren't allowed to say anything against them because that they were the rebels and the heroes and democratic fighters. And that was the case in the 80s when it was with the war in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan and Russia, right? Soviet Union.
Yes, with Osama bin Laden being interviewed by Robert Fisk for The Independent and being called a hero. So yeah, it's like they have a loop, they have a cycle, and people die, and countries get destroyed, and terrorists get created. And and people don't notice because at the end of the day, the Middle East scene is one big. They're not taught to differentiate between people. They're not taught that Soleimani fought alongside the U.S. in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda. They're not taught that.
Yeah, it is very easy for Americans, including myself, to sort of gloss over not only the regional differences within the Middle East, but also just to view the Middle East as a whole.
Yeah, to view the Middle East as a whole. Oftentimes, we in this country don't necessarily get the full view of the Middle East. That's why it's always great to have somebody on who can kind of give us details and explain the history and the interplay of the Middle East and why it's put together in the way it's put together. I want to go further into how Lebanon views the U.S., if that makes sense. Like, how does... when the U.S. takes some provocative action, let's say, like, for example, the killing of Soleimani, what is the perspective there?
Oh, you mean how people view the United States?
Right. Well, right. So, for example, on the killing of Soleimani, that's a provocative action that's taken by the United States. How is that seen from the standpoint of Lebanon? I mean, I would imagine there's a certain degree of consternation there, especially when Hezbollah is put together with the notion of defense against Israel, and the United States is lockstep with Israel.
Yes, so I think, in the past, people would see the United States as a separate entity with its own agenda in the region, and some people didn't like that agenda. But I think increasingly people in the Middle East have begun to realize that the essentially the United States has been hijacked by Israel, and for that reason, I think some people are beginning to forgive, where there was just hatred there towards Americans. People are starting to forgive the fact that like Americans have lost control over their country. Especially Trump has made that very, very visible, with his connections to Netanyahu and Kushner, and breaking international law, making the U.S. a rogue state, agreeing to assassinate Soleimani, and the crux of that is that when Iran launched those ballistic missiles at the Iraqi base, the U.S. base in Iraq, and demolished basically most of the base. The men didn't die because they were underground. They expected the United States to retaliate, but they said that the next thing that they would target is Israel. And as a result, the US did not retaliate. Because at the end of the day, the Zionist lobby is so powerful that the only thing that they care about is protecting Israel. And Trump says so himself. He said, we're in the Middle East, not for oil. We have more oil than even the biggest oil producers in the Middle East now.
Well, they also didn't want a war.
For Israel. These are his own words.
Yeah, but the U.S. didn't want a war. Trump explicitly didn't want a war. Meaning, Trump would take that provocative action because they're gambling that Iran wasn't going to go further. Meaning that they weren't going to escalate, that they were going to leave it. But he didn't want a war.
Which was a pretty stupid.
Well, right, because he had no power at that point. I mean, honestly, Iran could have responded in any particular way, and Trump would have been stuck in regards to a war. Like, he's fortunate that they did not escalate further than what, took place. Man, I am fascinated by the history here. So let me ask you this. From the standpoint of Lebanon, how does it get out of its current political quagmire? If that makes sense. I mean, like, you've made the point about how the sectarian lines were basically drawn by the countries that put it together. And it was done so in a way of basically divide and conquer. So if that was the way it was formed, how does the Constitution get changed? Or is there even a propensity to change it right now politically in order to kind of pull it out of its quagmire?
Yes, there is a push to change it. Yes, there's a drive to change it, to remove the sectarian basis. Because at the moment in the Constitution, there's a mandate where the president has to be Christian. I believe the prime minister has to be Sunni, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. And the head of parliament has to be Shiite. And as a result, basically, it's instead of leading by merit, it's leading by religion, and people are sick and tired of it. So if they can change their constitution to a secular one, that would be and something like Syria, that would be great. Another thing I think is that their economy, this is a tiny little statelet. Basically, its economy didn't survive without Syria, and vice versa. Like, Syria needed Lebanon as well, because Syria was under U.S. sanctions, and it was using Lebanon as a means to avoid those sanctions in order to survive, like in the war, so people can eat, basically. But because now Lebanon is being sanctioned in order to starve out Syria, that avenue has shut. So both Syria and Lebanon need each other, and I think in the future, and many Lebanese people, especially amongst the pro-Zionists.
I'm going to have to end it here, but I think you're trying to make the point that they're going to have to come back together at some point. Baram Sousley, you guys are listening to Political Commentator, Geopolitical Analyst. Thank you for joining us again. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner, I am your investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get into the headlines. In the news, the Justice Department on Monday labeled 3 cities, quote-unquote, anarchy jurisdiction. Those are New York, Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. The Democratic mayors in those cities have largely opposed federal intervention despite rising crime rates, referencing their desire to not escalate tensions. When state and local leaders impede their own law enforcement officials and agencies from doing their jobs, it endangers innocent citizens who deserve to be protected, including those who are trying to peacefully assemble and protest, Attorney William Barr said in a statement on Monday. We cannot allow federal tax dollars to be wasted when the safety of the citizens hangs in the balance. In a joint statement, the mayors of the 3 cities said that the order was thoroughly political and unconstitutional, and accused the president of playing cheap political games with congressional directed funds. NASA has formally outlined a $28 billion plan to return to the moon by 2024. As part of the program called Artemis, NASA proposed sending a man and a woman to the moon's surface in the first manned landing since 1972. The agency timeline would be contingent on Congress releasing $3.2 billion for the building of a landing system. Astronauts will travel in a Apollo-like capsule called Orion that will launch on a powerful rocket called SLS. Speaking on Monday afternoon U.S. time, NASA Administrator Jim Bernstein said the $28 billion costs associated with the next 4 years in the Artemis program to land on the moon, SLS funding, Orion funding, the human landing system, and of course spacesuits, all of those are part of the Artemis program are included. I would like to point out that the last man on the moon was 1972. That was, 50 years ago, give or take. And we are trying to repeat something that we did 50 years ago. That's not an accomplishment. Just pointing that out. Yes, I support it, but come on, we can do better. The body of Ruth Bader Ginsburg will be in repose at the United States Supreme Court tomorrow and Wednesday. She will be buried in the Arlington National Cemetery next to her late husband. Beijing has reportedly rejected the deal with Oracle and Walmart, with the editor-in-chief China's Global Times newspaper tweeting that Beijing won't approve the current agreement because the agreement would endanger China's national security interests and dignity. The last part, dignity. Global Times later posted an opinion piece rejecting the deal. Among the reasons for that rejection, 80% of the seats on the board of TikTok Global will be filled by Americans, and Oracle will be able to inspect the source code of TikTok, which is reportedly shared in part or whole with this version of the app used in China, Douyin. British tabloid The Daily Mirror reported this Sunday that the Attorney General for the U.S. Virgin Islands has demanded logs for Jeffrey Epstein's 4 helicopters and 3 planes from 1998 until his suicide last August. These logs would include the names and contact details of anyone who worked for the pilots or of anyone who interacted or observed, quote-unquote, Epstein or any passengers aboard flights on his airborne vehicles, as well as any complaints or reports of potentially suspicious conduct. In 2009, pilot David Rogers provided logs in 2009 showing Prince Andrew's, Bill Clinton, Kevin Spacey, and Naomi Campbell were among the pilots or among those aboard Epstein's Lolita Express, with lawyers for those victims saying in 2009 logs did not include flights made by Chief Pilot Larry Fiske, who flew for Epstein for more than 25 years. A legal source for the Mirror reportedly said that the records that have been subpoenaed will make the ones Rogers provided look like a post-it note. Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson is expected to announce the new coronavirus restrictions later in the day, ordering pubs, restaurants to close at 10 p.m. and telling workers to stay home if you can. Pubs and other venues are expected to be allowed to serve seated customers only, and drinkers will be prevented from gathering in crowds. This follows an order from Johnson in July which urged staff to get back to work if you can. Minister for the Cabinet Office Michael Gove confirmed the move this morning. And last, prominent critic of Xi Jinping was arrested and sentenced to 18 years in prison on corruption charges. After years spent criticizing the CCP and Xi Jinping, starting as a blogger on the platform Weibo, a Beijing court announced that it had found Ren Zibang guilty of embezzling public funds and taking bribes totaling $2.9 million. He was detained in March and removed from the Communist Party in June for smearing the party and the country's image and being, quote-unquote, disloyal and dishonest with the party. The trial reportedly lasted 1 day. It is an announcement of his ruling party on Tuesday. A Beijing court said Ren accepted his 18-year sentence and would not appeal. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So the moon thing, I want to let me do this. I want to go back to the moon thing, but I want to start here. Sanders made a comment about Joe Biden. Now, Sanders comes out, and this angers me so much, which is the reason why I'm bringing this up. Bernie Sanders is warning that if the one-time rival Joe Biden does not do more to promote his policies and reach out to Latino voters, the Democratic presidential nominee is at risk of falling short to President Donald Trump in November. Now, my point, my argument, the thing that you have heard me prattle on about, as Ingrid has said, has been that if you really did want Joe Biden to have a better chance of winning, if you really did want to get Joe Biden over the finish line, if your name is Bernie Sanders and you are part of this left that is terrified of Donald Trump, then it would have been in your best interest to actually push Biden and to use your supporters as leverage to get him to acclimate the party policy that the American public required and needed in this moment of crisis. That would have been your best interest. That would have been the way that you could have gotten people organically into the party. Now, yes, that would have demanded risk. That would have demanded bravery. That would have demanded, to a certain degree, non-cowardice in going after him and pushing him on that very specific point. But understand what would have happened. He either would have acclimated and said, okay, fair enough. Your 20 million supporters who are standing lockstep with you that refuses to support me because I won't support these policies, fair enough, I'll acclimate. Or he would tell those people to kick rocks. And he would choose to tank the election to Donald Trump, a man that they call the apocalypse, as opposed to acclimating the policy that 80% of the public or 80% of the party supports. Not to mention, you're in the midst of a pandemic. But Sanders knew this going in. And Sanders knew that that task force was bogus. And despite knowing that task force was bogus, despite shoving his people to Biden, and I would even make the argument that despite being, a useful idiot, I'm sorry, he knew that the upper players who were thinking of this political space understood that if he lost, he was going to support whoever that Democrat was, and he was going to sheepdog his supporters to whoever that Democrat was. And this is what you have. And unfortunately, the best chance for Sanders would have been to actually push, despite that being counterintuitive for some reason in regards to the way our current politics runs. He didn't do that. So now it's just begging. Shane, that's sad to me because Bernie Sanders has been in politics long enough to know that the task force was bogus. He was in it long enough to know that they were gaming him, that the moment that he lost, that they knew what was going to happen with his support for Biden. And yet, Now he comes out after all of his political capital has been spent and basically says, yeah, Joe Biden needs to be more lefty on some of these policies because I don't think he's getting Latino voters. No, he's not. And not in a measure that Clinton was getting Latino voters. But Biden has been running it as if he doesn't care. Because for him, he understands that people are not there because they love him. They're there because they feel they have no other choice. And an inversion of democracy itself. So, Shane, how do you see this? Because you're not...
Marl.
Shane?
Marl, so you're married now, but I'm sure you've dated women and then you've broken up with them. And you know how like after you've dated somebody for a while and you really like them, even if you're pissed at them, you think about them kind of constantly.
Yeah.
Because they're a part of your heart. That's where you are with Bernie, man. And
Yes,
I'm
it
here
is.
as your friend.
It is.
To tell you, Bernie's over you. You should get over Bernie too, man. Bernie's not coming back.
Oh,
You gotta broaden your horizons.
You should have heard my the language and the profanity that was hurled at Sanders. So no, it's not that. I think my issue here is that you always make the point of saying, we're the leaders. We're the leaders. And when you make that point, it's like there's potential, but there's never a fulfillment of that potential. So the people who should, at this moment, honestly, who should have, at the very moment that Sanders lost, should have basically said, look, you're not getting our votes unless you back X or Y. But those people laid down. So it's like the potential is there, but for whatever reason, there is a perspective that is in their heads that tells them that the moment that the primary is over, everybody lays down. Even if you are not represented by them, you still lay down. And I'm saying that is a weird perspective to take. And unfortunately, those are the leaders, laying down. I mean, like, it's not so much that I'm saying, loving Sanders. No, that's not it. It's just I'm pointing out how the potential for something different was here for this year in 2020. And it was all squandered. It was an understanding that these policies are popular. It was an understanding that the American public was on board for XYZ. And instead of them saying, all right, this is the year for the first time where we know these are popular, that the public is on this side. And taking away any candidate for the moment, just the policy itself. And you find this in the context of a pandemic, in the context of fires. I mean, you just fled fires to come over to floods on the other side of the country. And it just seems like it was squandered. That's all. I mean, so it's not even a feeling of Sanders. It's a feeling of the squandering, if that makes sense. There's a distinction there. Shane, does that make sense?
I guess I don't see these guys. I don't see Bernie as a political leader so much. I see him maybe as he's like the fringe of leadership, but it's more like he's a part of the political managerial class, frankly. And we're at the point in party politics where if you get into one of those positions of power, that is who you are, is a political manager, effectively. I don't really have any affection for him, man.
But it's not
I guess
Sanders.
I was never a Bernie girl.
But that's what I'm trying to tell you. It's not Sanders. That's what I want you to understand. It's it's the feeling of something squandered. It's not like, take Sanders out of it for the moment. And put in for the moment this potential of, hey, there's a potential to actually get something done. And then in the context of that, having that dashed. And not just dashed, not because of Sanders specifically per se, but more so because you have a group that is considered to be on the left that has no understanding of what political power is or how to even use it. And in real terms, over the last 40 years, just like this year, they lay down. And this year, more than any other year, would have been the year where you could have made that basic argument that, yeah, no more, we're not playing this anymore. This is what the American public wants, and this is what they need. But instead of them doing that, they laid down. That's my point. It's not Sanders. It's not even AOC specifically. It's the loss of hope or the squandering of hope or the squandering of opportunity that I think took place in 2020. And because of that, I think it led to a Biden who Sanders and AOC are like, yeah, Biden needs to take on these more lefty policies. Well, yeah, you don't have any power for that. And Biden versus Trump, which is like, man, are you talking about a painful, like reconciliation in regards to looking at what your politics are versus the crisis that your country is in? So it's not Sanders. It's the squandering of hope. That's what I'm trying to get across. Let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment, and we will be taking calls.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas. That's my co-host and myself, Shane Stranahan. And we're taking calls, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, I think I'm gonna stick with my girlfriend analogy here. You know, after you split up, you wonder, was it my fault? Was it her fault? You think about all the wasted time. You think about the emotions. You think about where things could have gone. And frankly, if you're still attached to her and you're sort of sulking about it, then it's not good for you. You're not going to find somebody else who might be better for you and something else that might be longer lasting. And in this case, something that might actually change our political system. I think you need to move into the anger phase or something like that. You need to move into, I mean, not, I'm not asking you to hate the guy, but there's a degree to which I think it's justified to resent him and to reject him and to say that what he did was inappropriate. He was too weak. And we need to move on and find better people. And maybe you're there, but I just want to,
You're not listening to me at all. It's not Sanders. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Sanders might have been the avatar of all this stuff in the beginning. And I do have affection for the guy, don't get me wrong. And I'm also angry at the guy, so also don't get me wrong. And if you, again, look at my video track, you will find that anger in those videos pretty consistently over this stuff. But it's not Sanders. That's what I'm trying to make the point to you. It really is missed opportunity. And it goes beyond Sanders because I look at that from the standpoint of lefties as a whole, not individual. Meaning you had tens of millions of people that were on the same page. Everybody in alignment. And those 10 or so million people all of a sudden folded, despite the fact knowing that they won the policy argument across the board. And you look at that and you think to yourself, what are you doing? Why are you folding? You are not the same as these other guys. Then you need to assert and back up policies that represent the interests of your constituencies and represent yourself. And instead of them doing that, they folded. I'm talking about tens of millions of people. That's not a Bernie thing. That's a people thing. And I'm saying that hurts, that bites. That's not a Sanders issue. That's the point I'm trying to make to you. It's a missed opportunity issue from the standpoint of all of these people who realized they were on the same page, who won the policy argument, and yet immediately folded the moment that any level of pressure was applied to them. But let's go to the callers. Malik in DC. And by the way, I want to get to NASA also because the NASA thing is interesting to me. We're going to the moon again, something that we did in the 70s. And they're putting this out like, yes, let's do this. And you're like, but you did that in the 70s. I mean, like, think of all the technological innovation that's taken place between now and the 70s. Think of all of your technological capabilities from the standpoint of materials and all of those things. And if you're thinking of a project to set this kind of idealistic standard that Shane was talking about, you can't do better than the moon? You can't do better than the moon? Come on. Yes, I'm being a bit cynical here, but I don't think wrongly so. I mean, you have other companies that are putting satellites in orbit all around the world for internet coverage. You have companies that are building potential hyperloops. And you match this. And I know it's not necessarily a game where you're trying to match it per se, but I think NASA in and of itself should be idealistic. It's kind of like Superman in comic books. Superman is supposed to represent idealism, expansion, humanism, and so forth. And yes, American nationalism. Well, NASA is supposed to represent something similar in regards to its human idealism, expansionism, your ability to use technology for the best of our abilities. Is it really just going back to the moon? Shane, am I being too hard on NASA here? Am I being a hater?
I think this is way better than nothing. I mean, it's just we'll see how it actually goes out. We'll see if Congress keeps it going. We'll see if they don't cut the budget at some point. You know, those kinds of things can happen. I think you're right. I'll put it like this: I'm glad that we're doing this, and so I don't want to hit on them for not doing enough when I'm glad that they're doing it in the first place. But you're right. Better than the moon than the sun, I'll say. I don't think they're planning on building a Dyson sphere around the sun anytime soon. That's not why we'd be going there. So better to go to the moon than there. But hey, with the recent discovery of potential life on Venus,
wait.
Venus would be a good destination too. Maybe
Venus would be interesting. Yes, Venus would be interesting. I guess we're saying, why not try? Like, we didn't know how to get to the moon when Kennedy was made that speech. And God, please go back and look at that speech. That is one of the best political speeches that you would ever see. But he didn't know how to do it. It's a great speech, right? He was like, we put, this the best of our abilities. We do this not because, what do you say? But like, why does Rice play Texas or something like that? We go to the moon. The best of our human abilities, et cetera, et cetera. God, it was a great speech. I guess I'm making the point that we did that. And at the time, it was massively emancipatory because we didn't know how to do it. We had to develop the technology and the skill and the acumen to do those things. I'm making the point that if we're going to do something, it should be like that. That prioritizes the best of our skill and abilities now, our capabilities now with the materials and those things now. Those technologies were able to be used here on planet Earth for all sorts of industries. Not just that, it gave these people this kind of view of, we're going to space. You're looking up to the heavens, realizing that you have a future up there. Like, that's a beautiful thing. Am I missing something here? Okay, we have callers, but go for it, Shane.
Yeah, no, and I'll jump to the call straight after. It's just, I mean, the bit that I like about that speech that always comes back to me, and it is probably the most famous part of that speech, is I'm just going to quote here: "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." Right. I think I think that last bit is actually incredibly important. I think the idea, that there's a way in which it can be sort of self-servingly dysfunctional if you're just doing things because they're difficult, but there's another sense in which you should not shy away from difficult tasks. If what we need, to survive, literally dealing with a variety of crises, from the threat of nuclear warfare to the decline of the global climate, et cetera, if what we need is to undertake sort of larger steps, much larger steps, then there's a sense in which you're going to have to commit yourself to discipline and to these larger decisions and to investing yourself in these larger decisions. And I think that, there's something, invigorating about that. Anyway, we've got callers. I think we should go to them. Malik calling in from DC. Malik, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, good morning, fellas. Well, I wanted to say that I do empathize with Jamarl and his issues around Bernie Sanders. I do believe that Bernie Sanders, from my perspective, even though amongst my peers, we consider him a fake socialist, folks who consider ourselves to be more revolutionary in our perspective. But I do think he was the last opportunity for a leftist populist movement. But I honestly believe that much of his movements were extremely deliberate. And I use an example of there was a Democratic Party candidate, a Native American woman, I believe out of Kansas, that she was a Democrat, and Bernie Sanders and AOC flew into town to support a less popular Democratic Party candidate, but someone who was actually closer to the inner circle in the leadership of the DNC. But this woman was a popular Native American candidate, and they actually specifically flew into town to derail her candidacy. But anyway, you guys can look into that. I wanted to just touch very quickly on your issue of leadership. I just want to say, guys, I think we're in a time where your leadership amongst Americans, and I think amongst humanity in general, are going to come from places that you're not going to expect. Your leadership is going to come from people in holistic health, from people in spirituality, in religion, and the low levels of the grassroots. They're not going to come from the places that you're going to expect. And I think that, you know, your position is to assist that. And I'll leave that there.
I agree. Straight up, Malik, I agree. I would throw other people in there. I would throw scientists. I would throw philosophers. I would throw artists. I would throw farmers, ranchers. I would throw a whole bunch of people in there. You know, different people have different takes. But this idea that the establishment, which, you know, is fairly homogeneous, it's fairly homogenous in terms of what it looks like and how it works and what people are doing in it, what backgrounds they have. I think that you're right. It's not going to come. The leadership's not going to come from there. There are going to be elements of that, you know, because there are a lot of smart people in institutions, but they've kind of been co-opted culturally by years or decades of living in those institutions and coming to believe the BS that those institutions believe. That's my take.
1,000% agree.
Jamarl, what's yours?
1,000% agree. Completely agree. And when I keep making the point that says it's not about a leader thing, and I keep saying 20 million people, I keep saying that because I'm trying to make the point that the audience, the groups, the public itself has to at some point assert itself. And that's not, you know, necessarily a leadership thing. Sometimes the public itself can just get fed up and almost this kind of wave of sorts. So no, I 1,000% agree. Let's go to Robert in DC. Robert, what's going on?
Good morning, good day, guys. I wanted to start off by thanking one of our loyal listeners for piggybacking off my feelings off the public broadcasting thing a few weeks back. Yeah, she took my thoughts and clarified them for our listeners. But we all got to thank your loyal co-host for pulling you back off the Bernie ledge. Because I never met a Bernie bro that was a brother, except I haven't met you yet personally, but I guess you.
Oh, man, I've met a ton of Black Bernie voters. I can introduce you to several of them.
But on the back end, though, I'm a Biden guy. You know, it's plenty of room on the back of the Biden bus for you to, just creep on and, get on the bandwagon.
That's okay.
We got to win this thing.
Let me ask you this.
Opinion, though.
Okay, go for it. I'm sorry.
Opinion on the public broadcasting thing. Do you feel as though is there a certain leaning and bias towards the other guy? You know what I'm saying? Even doesn't it? It's supposed to be a balance thing, doesn't it?
You mean PBS?
Yeah.
Seeming to be for Donald Trump. I haven't.
Well, it's supposed to be some type of balance there, doesn't it? Or it's just all leaning left. It's just a green light that way.
I don't see it that way. I mean, PBS comes across to me as more of a corporate thing. I mean, Shane, am I insane on this? I've never taken PBS to be a left-wing rag of sorts.
I would say they lean left, but I don't think left-right is the fundamental dichotomy here. It's something like globalism versus nationalism or populism, and authoritarians versus the people, or something like this. I mean, people can be mob-like and certainly support authoritarians, but I think there's something more like that. The elites versus the public. I think there's something like that. And so if you look at PBS, the vast majority of their stories are going to be either whether they're left or right-leaning, whether they support, companies or governments. They're going to be representative of what the elite thinks. I think that holds true for pretty much all state-run media in the U.S. Yeah. And I think it holds true for all of NBC, CNN, Fox, for those sort of ABC, et cetera, those main outlets who do news. They're gonna espouse the beliefs of the establishment because ultimately they are a part of the establishment, just de facto. That's my take. What's yours, Jamarl?
No, I agree with you. I mean, I 1,000% agree. I don't think. I mean, I have a few feelings about that call. One, a large percentage of Sanders voters were people of color. In fact, the majority. The majority were also poor, or in that camp. From the standpoint of African Americans, yes, Joe Biden was getting a majority of older African Americans, but from the standpoint of the younger African American demographic, he was getting the younger. Again, I've made the point over and over again that if you check my content, I've been pretty derisive towards Sanders for the last several months. But this is less about Sanders.
Yeah, and I don't mean to get too much on you.
Yeah, I mean, but the caller was very specific, and I'm just saying, my issue here was lack of hope, or this kind of diminishing of hope, where you had an opportunity, a clear opportunity, where the light at the end of the tunnel didn't have to be a bus. It could have been something else, but that would have required all of these other human beings to say, we're done, we're fed up, and to walk. And until that happens, nothing changes. And that's what I mean when I say it just feels like a missed opportunity. But let's do this. Let's take a break, and let's come back with Margaret, Kimberly. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and Margaret Kimberly. Margaret is a senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and the author of Presidential, Black America, and the Presidents. Margaret, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us. All right. Let's talk about RBG. What do you think about, in retrospective, in memoriam, what do you think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Let's just start there.
Well, your listeners can read my Black Agenda Report column tomorrow, and I called it the Democrats' supreme failure in making sure they kept the Senate majority that would have allowed Obama to proceed with the Merrick Garland nomination. And frankly, I have to say about the late Justice Ginsburg, she should have stepped down. In 2014, she had already been diagnosed with cancer. She'd already been treated for cancer. Obama spoke to her, and I think in not strong enough terms, tried to coax her to retire, to step down. She refused to do it. She was quoted as saying, and I'm paraphrasing, who are you going to get that's better than me? Well, I'm sure she was a very smart woman, but they could have found another very smart woman for Obama to appoint.
Wow. I understand that point. That makes sense. Where basically, if you're looking at this from an entirely politics angle, or but this gets to, I think, the thing that we've lost with RBG's passing, I think, is basically our innocence. And what I mean by that is the Supreme Court has been a political instrument for decades. And everybody pretends, for whatever reason, that it's not. Despite the fact that these guys are fighting tooth and nail, usually anyway. Obama didn't. He was using Merrick Garland as kind of a thing to hang over the left's head to try to get him to vote Hillary Clinton in. And he didn't fight for that seat at all. But under normal circumstances, this is one of those things that these guys fight over because they understand that that person is going to be in for life and that person is going to be ruling on laws. And they're going to be doing so with a political bend. I mean, am I wrong in this? I mean, basically, to me, that the public is looking at the Supreme Court with RBG dying as an apocalyptic event. And if they're indeed looking at it as an apocalyptic event, is the Supreme Court non-biased. You can't have it both ways.
Well, it's apocalyptic. It's apocalyptic because they messed up on all those things you mentioned. They could have literally shut down the Senate in order to force Merrick Garland through. They had options, and since that time, some Senate Democrats have admitted they wish they had done more. But everyone was assuming that Hillary Clinton was going to win.
That's right.
And so this is very typical of Democrats. They exist as a party not to meet their voters' needs, but in order to game the system and sometimes to cut deals with Republicans and to maintain good relationships with their donor class. Everything except fighting for the issues that are so important for Democratic voters.
But how?
And so now we have this debacle.
Wait, but how? How did they do that? Like, meaning the Republican Party, they have a constituency that has allowed them to propagate themselves. And oftentimes, the least or the less the people who vote, the better their chances are because, they have a tight constituency. Democrats, however, are supposed to be representing philosophically the interests of the left or philosophically the interests of the poor, the people of color, et cetera, et cetera. And yet they don't do that. And so they can still somehow get away with it. I'm asking, how do they find the ability to get away with basically not representing the interests? I mean, I've ran through these stats before in regards to what the public wants, not even just their own specific party, like letting down the public itself. 72% want to expand Social Security, 69% Medicare for all, 67% $15 minimum wage, 67% legalize marijuana, 64% to tax extreme wealth. Going down the line, they don't do it. And yet, they can still go out there and try to get those people's votes and try to get America to vote them in office. I'm asking you, how are they able to pull that off, that magic trick of not representing the interests, by the same token, still getting in office?
Oh, propaganda. So the first thing they do is point to the Republicans, see how horrible they are. And they're very upfront about it. It's very gangsterish. Well, it's us or them. So if you don't support us, then you're supporting Trump, especially with Trump in office. They lie. So, for example, they lost control of the Senate and the House, and they'd lost state legislatures across the country simply by not supporting those races with money. All their efforts and energy go into presidential elections. So they just gave up control. And they, and they constantly have a Republican villain. It can be the Koch brothers or it can be Trump himself. Meanwhile, the Republicans play hardball. Trump shut down the government over some BS. I think it was over the border wall.
Yeah, it was the border.
And they just do what they need to do. But Democrats were like, well, Hillary's going to get in. We don't really have to fight for Merrick Garland. You're supposed to fight based on principles. So it's not really a political party at all, but they get fewer and fewer votes. Half the public voting eligible population doesn't bother at all.
Right.
The local races get very few voters. The people who do come out are there's voter suppression of various kinds, but the Democrats will, for example, in the last election, all they did was blame Russia. They didn't blame themselves. Obviously, the media, unfortunately, obviously they would not admit to the mess they made for themselves. But and they have friends in the corporate media who amplify their propaganda that's used to fool the public. So that's what we've ended up with. We've ended up with this non-party party that doesn't do what people want. If the Republicans didn't exist, they'd have to invent them as an excuse for not producing for their voters. And so here we are. They rigged for the second time, rigged their primary process in order to prevent Bernie Sanders, who is the leftish candidate, although he represents what most people want. And they did it against him. It was very obvious what all kinds of criticism. Russia preferred him, and then getting the others to drop out and coalesce around Biden, a man who they have to hide. Trump is having rallies every week, and Biden is being hidden in a basement somewhere.
That's true. But doesn't that fall to the rose? I bristle at this type of thing. I mean, don't get me wrong. I agree with everything you just said. They did go after him, saying it, but he was complicit. And not just complicit in it, all of the left. I mean, isn't this a thing where the party is supposed to be held accountable by some element of the party? And so if you have these quote-unquote progressive Democrats that are part of the party and they allow and watch this take place, I mean, is there anything that's intrinsic to the party that is of the party? Meaning, is there anything that they were willing to die on the flag over? And if lefties are continually supporting and backing a party that is doing this, does not fall on lefties? Meaning, it's one thing if you stay with the guy who continuously beats you. At some point, after like 40 years, is there not a certain degree of complicity in this?
Yes, there is, and with Sanders especially. I have issues with him. I'm green. I'm not a Democrat. I was hoping he would stay in and fight, and at least show his people a way forward out of this trap of the duopoly. But he folded, and that's very unfortunate. So I think you have people who were all dressed up now with no place to go.
Right.
And I think we saw that in the protest movement. I think that was partly a reaction to this complete loss of any progressive agenda by the Democrats. But I think people need to show some courage and realize that the entire system needs to be torn up. And crying about Ginsburg's death and crying about Biden being the nominee, it's worthless if you just keep supporting them.
Exactly.
There has to be a determination to leave.
1,000% agree. 1,000% agree. Donald Trump is talking about choosing a woman for Ruth Bader Ginsburg's position. And he may even choose a woman of color. And I think that's great because this is bringing identity politics coming home to roost. Am I wrong? Like, are the Democrats really going to be able to attack a woman of color if Donald Trump chooses a woman of color for Ruth Bader Ginsburg position, especially if she is, I don't know, like Anthony Scalia with a skirt?
Well, if they don't attack his nominee, then they are bigger wimps than I thought they were. This is a moment for people not to despair, but to be active. And first of all, they have to leave the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders has to be the last progressive who tries to get the Democratic Party nomination. That party has to be abandoned in favor of real activism, organized activism.
We have about 2 minutes. Now, the question is why? Because I keep making this argument all the time also. But in about 2 minutes before we take our break, why is it imperative that all of these people say we're done, we're fed up, and they walk out the door?
We have to save ourselves. Everything from climate change. I wrote last week about how the Democrats are phony, how Obama bragged about increasing oil production, but then points fingers at Trump for leaving the wishy-washy Paris climate accords. They are not going to save us. We don't have a choice. We do not have a choice. We have to go back to organizing of decades past and force the system's change. That's the only way it ever has changed. So I think people have to realize that and not see, for example, the civil rights movement, the liberation movement, as something to fetishize and worship, but to really look at what people did, the struggles that people undertook for years in order to have some sort of success with legislation. So that is what people have to do. We don't have a choice anymore.
They also decapitated the socialist aspect from the political aspect. meaning, King was a socialist. But that's the part that gets kind of washed away and washed to the side when they're talking about him in lieu of just entirely identity. No, I 1,000% agree with you. You guys are listening to Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor of the Black Agenda Report and author of the Prejudicial Black America and the Presidents. We'll be back in a moment. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
We're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and Margaret Kimberly, our guest. Margaret, I'm going to apologize. I'm having some problems with my internet apparently, or something like that. Trying to figure that out. Anyway, for those listening, Margaret Kimberly is a senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and the author of Prejudicial Black America and the Presidents. Having a conversation about RBG and wider political problems. Margaret, you're bringing up the good point. This is a little bit out of my depth, or at least it's before I started to pay closer attention to politics, specifically national, domestic politics. You're saying that they were basically lame ducks. You're saying that the Democrats were lame ducks. They did not make enough effort to get the Democratic Senate that they would have needed to get a replacement for RBG confirmed back in 2014. Could you go back into why do you say that? What makes you say that? It strikes me as weird just because I don't understand why they wouldn't do that. If it's in their best interest, if it's sort of existential for them in some sense, doing the work that their investors want them to do in terms of maintaining a majority that their investors can use. Why do you think they didn't do that? And what specifically did they not do that they should have done back in 2012, 2014 to get a majority in the Senate?
Well, they do spend Senate races are very expensive. I know here in New York, in order to be a quote unquote viable candidate, you have to raise $30 million. So, excuse me, I know that their donors pitch in, but Democrats don't want to, they want to be part of the permanent government. So they do not present themselves to voters as agents of any kind of change. If they ran on the issue of, this was after Obamacare was passed, we were all told, anybody who criticized it, this is an example, was told, well, this is just the start. We're going to do more later. If they ran on the issue of providing everybody with free health care, then they would win. If they said, we're going to raise the minimum wage, well, people struggling to live on minimum wage salaries would get out there and vote for them. But they're caught in this bind of being dependent on their donor class, whose interests are diametrically opposed to the interests of the people. You cannot please both of them. So if you're going to please some hedge fund guy, that means you're going to ignore the person who needs a minimum wage increase, who needs a living wage. So they keep trying to walk this tightrope and serve. You can't serve two masters. Now I'm getting biblical. Some expression like that.
That's what it is.
But they can't. So so the real master are the money people, and they're hoping to keep getting their money, but also get their people out. And the end result was Obama being president with having no control of the House or the Senate, and most state legislatures being lost.
Also, keep in mind, Obama was running Obama for America on the side of the Democratic National Committee. And so you had basically two organizations that was sucking up cash, that was draining away funds from the Democrats' ability to win the House and the Senate.
Absolutely. And nobody's in their they're good at propaganda. So, and of course, the Republicans make that easy with the racist attacks against him. I mean, how hard is it to hate Mitch McConnell? Or what was the man's name? Boehner, the orange-faced man. I was forgetting his name.
John Boehner.
And who were constantly attacking him. So the Democrats just point to them, and it's either him or them. But that's not the issue. I don't see why there's a need to protect people who don't protect us.
You know,
Democrats need.
You nail something else that's really important for people to understand. The Republican Party is ideologically in alignment. The Democratic Party is not. I mean, you basically have, dollars versus pitchforks. And both of those things are in the same party. And for the longest time, you've only had dollars. And so that's the way the party went, without any level of, hedging on that, meaning without anything to pull them back within restraint. And this is where I get to the left. Because all things being equal, the left would be that restraint, because the left is supposed to be the part that says, no, we don't agree with these tax cuts. We don't agree with you not providing Medicare for all. We don't agree with XYZ. And yet they allow the party to keep going because they get scared into this notion of, oh my God, Republicans are terrifying, and so we have to vote for this person or that person. So that's why I like that you kind of make that point of like, these guys are out of alignment. You have people who are dirt poor who need that level of the party to be representative of the left as it's philosophically supposed to be. And yet you have people who are, like you say, hedge fund managers, and people who are dumping tons of money into these guys' pockets for them not to do those things that the public wants and demands. How do you get the party to do that? And is it possible to get it to do that at all?
You can't reform them. You can't move them left.
Right.
There's no holding feet to the fire. All of that is phony. You cannot do any of these things. The only thing people can do is save themselves and look for other electoral options. And, this spoiler thing, we do have a system that is hostile to third parties and renders them to spoiler status. But things are already spoiled. Right. Look what we got with the Democrats, the Supreme Court, this hallowed institution, the thing that is used to shut people up. If anybody asks a question or says they don't know if they want to vote for Biden, what are they told? But what about the federal judiciary? And they screwed that up.
Yeah.
So they screwed up. How the heck did Donald Trump get to be president anyway? Hillary Clinton had $1 billion and then couldn't get 10,000 more votes in Michigan. Or make sure that all the votes were counted so that she won. So I think abandoning them, actually the worse they get, the more of a case you can make for leaving them all together.
Well, democracy. I want to get to a moment of democracy. And what does it mean when you have, or representative government? And what does that really mean in the context of a system where, 70% of the people who are backing Biden are doing so because they're terrified of Trump? Like, it inverts politics. It seems to be an inversion of the political process to say that we're just so terrified, we're not voting for anything other than getting rid of the other guy. And so it's like your country has all of these crises. I mean, you have food shortages where people are standing at these food banks for hours. You have older stories, these heartbreaking stories of these older people being evicted from their homes, 70-something. And you're talking about like millions. And 30 million people out of a job. And the candidate that is running for the Democratic Party doesn't really care about that stuff. Like, it's not an affirmative case of, we're going to provide this or we're going to provide that. We're going to do this. It's more so, vote me in office. I'm not Trump. And I'm saying that's a sad case of politics. And I'm saying that says something about representative government in and of itself, right?
Yes, it does. And they don't even, for example, we're always told Trump is a fascist. Trump is a fascist. I saw a video yesterday of some Trump supporters blocking an entrance to a polling place in Fairfax, Virginia. Now, I noticed watching the videos on Twitter, these videos have been viewed millions of times. Has the Democratic Party made a statement? Have they said to Trump, Are you going to condemn people who are your supporters who are trying to stop others from voting? The people with guns, having checkpoints in Oregon, they're all Trump supporters, but no one says anything. Nobody does. So I don't see the point in continuing to support these people, even as they talk about how horrible Trump is, but then say, well, we agree with him on foreign policy, and that's something I'd like to discuss another time. There are all these foreign policy crises all over the world that nobody's talking about. Right. U.S. and Russian troops having little skirmishes in Syria, and the new Space Force being sent to Saudi Arabia. It's very, very dangerous, but the Democrats are aligned with all of those things. So they are not serving our interests, and people need to lose their fear, but people don't realize how the impact they can have. We have been conditioned to believe by that propaganda I mentioned that the only thing you can do is vote. That's it. That's all. So since Ginsburg died, Act Blue has raised $100 million in like 3 days.
Wow.
There is nothing about the Democrats having money that's going to save you. Nothing. Who raised more money in 2016? Hillary Clinton.
Great for the DNC to be fundraising that much. Of course, good for them as a party. But I mean, here's the thing. So if the idea is to boycott the DNC, the only alternative that I can think of is you vote for another party, one of the quote unquote third parties, or you try to form an alternative party. If you're not going to reform the DNC, you're going to try to form a new one. What's your take, Margaret?
Well, I'm Green, so I think people should join the Green Party. But I also think people need to realize that you don't have a choice to save yourself anymore. You do not. You do not have any choice. You cannot be silent. The planet is quite literally heating up. We have a president, and yesterday the attorney general said that New York, a place where I live, is an anarchist jurisdiction, and they're going to try to take our federal funds. What are people waiting for? What has to happen? Has Biden or Harris or any of them made a statement about that? No, they have not. So why would you stick with this party which does nothing to help you, which has proved itself a failure over many years? You've got to get rid of them, and you have to look to yourself.
I also think lefties need to realize that the priorities of the party and their priorities are not necessarily in alignment. And so a loss is not the same thing for, let's say, the average person as it is just, let's say, somebody at the top echelon of the party. So a Nancy Pelosi and her $100 million will be fine with Donald Trump winning a second term, as opposed to the person who is going to be evicted from their homes who won. And so it's a different pressure that they apply. But I think because that pressure is different, they don't necessarily fight. It doesn't dig into them in the way that it would dig into somebody who was directly affected by the lack, let's say, of policies that these guys pass.
You're absolutely right. That's why the Democrats' real election was getting rid of Bernie Sanders. That was their real campaign. They are rich. You mentioned Nancy Pelosi having $100 million net worth, and others. Their lives aren't going to change if Trump is president. But all the things we're supposed to be afraid of impact other people. So they don't really care. They'll give up an election. You can see very clearly where their interests lie, and they don't lie with us. So why is it supposed to be such a catastrophe if they lose? I don't understand. I was reading about Michigan, this all-important state, must-win state that Trump flipped. They have no field offices there. People don't know where to find campaign signs. People who want to volunteer have no one to talk to. That, in a nutshell, tells you how important, or rather how unimportant, this election really is to the Democratic Party. And it makes no sense to be loyal to them.
Margaret
Kimberly, thank you so much for joining us. We're out of time. She is the senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report, also the author of Presidential Black America and the Presidents. You're listening to Fault Lines.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, the most disruptive show in American politics. In the center of the country. I'm actually living in Sioux Falls, South Dakota at this point, no longer on the West Coast. I am your investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get straight into it. In the news, the Justice Department on Monday labeled 3 cities, quote-unquote, anarchy jurisdictions. Those are New York City, Seattle, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. Democratic mayors in those cities have largely opposed federal intervention despite rising crime rates, referencing their desire to not escalate tensions. And William Barr, from the DOJ, Attorney General, is now threatening to prevent those cities from accessing public funds. This is a quote from Barr in his statement on Monday. When state and local leaders impede their own law enforcement officers and agencies from doing their jobs, it endangers innocent citizens who deserve to be protected, including those who are trying to peacefully assemble and protest. We cannot allow federal tax dollars to be wasted when the safety of the citizenry hangs in the balance. End quote. In a joint statement, the mayors of the 3 cities said that the order was, quote, thoroughly political and unconstitutional, end quote, and they accused the president of, quote, playing cheap political games with congressionally directed funds, end quote. NASA has formally outlined a $28 billion plan to return to the moon by 2024. As part of a program called Artemis, NASA proposes sending a man and a woman to the moon's surface in the first manned landing since 1972. The agency's timeline will be contingent on Congress releasing $3.2 billion for building a landing system. Astronauts will travel in an Apollo-like capsule called Orion that will launch on a powerful rocket called SLS. Speaking on Monday afternoon, that's U.S. time, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said the $28 billion, this is a quote, the $28 billion represents the costs associated for the next 4 years in the Artemis program to land on the moon. SLS funding, Orion funding, the human landing system, and of course the spacesuits, all of those things that are part of the Artemis program are included, end quote. In our next headline, the body of Ruth Bader Ginsburg will lie in repose at the U.S. Supreme Court tomorrow and Wednesday. She will be buried in Arlington National Cemetery next to her late husband. It's actually uncertain right now about when that's going to happen. Expected to be later this week, although it could be next week. I've heard various outlets saying different things there. Our next headline, Beijing has reportedly rejected the deal with Oracle/Walmart, with the editor-in-chief of China's Global Times newspaper tweeting that Beijing won't approve the current agreement because, quote, the agreement would endanger China's national security, interests, and dignity, end quote. Global Times later posted an opinion piece rejecting the deal. Among the reasons for that rejection, well, 80% of the seats on the board of TikTok Global would be filled by Americans, leaving only one seat for the CEO, the head of ByteDance. And Oracle would be able to inspect the source code of TikTok, code which is reportedly shared in part or whole with the version of the app used in China, Douyin. So in other words, Oracle, tech company in the US, would have access to the code, some of which is shared with China's version of the app. And, if they're inspecting the code, they might access proprietary materials. They might learn stuff that they could use to hack it theoretically, etc. There are different concerns that China might justifiably have about that. Our next headline, British tabloid The Daily Mirror reported this Sunday that the Attorney General for the U.S. Virgin Islands has demanded logs for Jeffrey Epstein's 4 helicopters and 3 planes. That's from 1998 until his suicide last August. These logs would include the names and contact details of anyone who were pilots or of anyone who, quote-unquote, interacted with or observed Epstein or any passengers aboard flights on his airborne vehicles. Would also include any, quote, complaints or reports of potentially suspicious conduct, end quote. In 2009, pilot David Rogers provided logs in 2009. Wrote that wrong. In 2009, showing Prince Andrew, Bill Clinton, Kevin Spacey, and Naomi Campbell were among those aboard Epstein's Lolita Express. Lawyers for the victims said that the 2009 logs did not include flights made by Chief Pilot Larry Visosky, who flew for Epstein for more than 25 years. A legal source for the Mirror reportedly said that, quote, the records that have been subpoenaed will make the ones Rogers provided look like a Post-it note, end quote. Our next headline, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson is expected to announce new coronavirus restrictions later in the day, ordering pubs and restaurants to close at 10 p.m. and telling workers to, quote, stay at home if you can, end quote. Pubs and other venues are expected to be allowed to serve seated customers only, and drinkers will be prevented from gathering in crowds. This follows an order from Johnson in July in which he urged staff to, quote, get back to work if you can, end quote. Minister for the Cabinet Office, Michael Gove, confirmed the move this morning. My next headline, last headline here. A prominent critic of Xi Jinping was arrested and sentenced to 18 years in prison on corruption charges yesterday. After years spent criticizing the CCP and Xi Jinping, starting as a blogger on the platform Weibo, a Beijing court announced that it had found Ren Zhiqiang guilty of embezzling public funds and taking bribes from totaling 2.9 million American dollars. He was detained in March and removed from the Communist Party in June for, quote, smearing the party and country's image, end quote, and quote, being disloyal and dishonest with the party, end quote. Trial reportedly lasted 1 day. In its announcement of its ruling on Tuesday, it's today actually, a Beijing court said Ren accepted his 18-year sentence and would not appeal. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we're back. And yeah, man. Take it for a second, if you would, Jamarl. Still having internet problems. I'm trying to debug this.
No, absolutely. So I want to point to something that we were talking about yesterday. China's response to the, let's say, actions, the U.S. predatory actions on their company. And I kind of made the point, like, okay, well, what's their response? Because in this case, regardless of what China wants to be, meaning take any random game space, sometimes the actions of the opponents compel the behavior of the opposition, meaning you can't be an egalitarian kind of a kumbaya country in a game space where the U.S. takes a position that we do not want another Soviet Union, meaning we are going to be at odds with any country that has the capacity to grow and expand, especially with 1.3 billion people and with the, at this point, technological capacity that the U.S. recognizes in the country itself. And so when I asked about the tit for tat from the standpoint of the deal, my thought was there's no way they're going to allow Trump to prey on that company that way in this kind of grand politics of then turning around, recognizing weakness and saying, add another $5 billion on top of that just so we can propagandize to Americans about American imperialism and whatnot. Yeah. There had to be a response, and the response, to some degree, you would imagine had to be no. Now, some of this has to do with the way China, I would imagine, perceives itself. Is it a power among other powers? Is it of such where it no longer says it's going to take a backhand of the U.S. and this kind of level of indignity in regards to Trump's response? Or is it willing to accept that for other reasons? Well, it seems the answer is no. They're not willing to accept that. And a country that considers itself a power probably wouldn't. Would the U.S. accept something like that? The answer is probably no. And so you get that treatment with that deal. You also get, you know, if I am a country and I just want to grow economically, almost by definition, the economic growth is going to have influence, political influence. That political influence is going to allow you let's say, leverage in other nations' affairs. Now, the catch becomes, if your name is America, and you think to yourself, oh my God, the horse is out of the barn, we need to stop that. And you think of using all sorts of mechanisms at your command, including military. So you will ship weapons to Taiwan. China would get across, we don't like this. And so they would fly airships and whatnot over top of the country to get across their dissatisfaction. Now, the question is never really asked on whether or not China could be a partner. The question is always kind of taken and assumed that they won't be. The guest that we're going to have later today is going to be able to discuss that. But the kind of point that I'm making here is if China is not willing to accept this level of, let's say, disrespect, and they are willing to say, well, look, we're a power. You respect us in the same way you respect any other power. And just because you are taking an explicit policy to be aggressive and belligerent to anything that you consider to be a threat, that's not us. That is you creating an environment of hostility. Well, that argument makes sense to me. That argument has legs to me. I mean, the United States wanted the right to expand, and I would imagine that Britain and some of these other nations were bothered by the fact that the U.S. was expanding and the technology that it was using to do so. And so this is kind of just a typical thing amongst nations. But the catch here is the friction and hostility. And does that have the potential to become something that's more explosive? Now, we are doing a lot of China bashing in this country. And we did the same thing with Russia. We have a tendency to look outward, to point to our enemies, as opposed to dealing with the internal affairs of the nation. So Trump will call the immigrants are the problem. And he would act as if a band of poor people is some kind of insurgent army trying to come and take over the country, missing the point that many of the actions that we've taken in regards to foreign policy, especially in South America, the kill squads, the toppling of governments, the bombing of governments. I mean, we just passed 9/11. I guess I'm making the point, we have explicit policies that have generated the very conditions to which we are complaining about in regards to immigration. We have a tendency to look outside of us for enemies. It's the immigrants. It's the Russians. It's the Chinese. It's always somebody else, as opposed to actually dealing with your government has problems. Your country has an ideological issue in regards to the way it runs its affairs and to the people that it cares about more than others. You have to deal with that. You have a military that's spending like nearly $1 trillion and basically is a jobs program, as opposed to having an internal jobs program where you have the same amount of pride and feeling for the country as you do things that are in the best interest of the country, not kill people abroad.
I mean, I don't know, man. I think we
you don't think I'm being fair?
I think you're right that we vilify our enemies, but we vilify each other too. I mean, aren't we in like an intense, chaotic political divide where for years now the left has decried white supremacists and quote unquote literal Nazis on the right, and the right has decried quote unquote SJWs or whatever, and progressives on the left. Like, I mean, hasn't this just gotten more and more intense over time? You say that we look for enemies outside, but we look for enemies inside too. We just look for enemies everywhere.
Well, I think it's worse than that. And you know, when I talk about this stuff, and I talk about like social safety nets and these type of things, I say this because if you don't have that, then we have no way of relating to one another. Those are the things that are part and parcel to being Americans. And unfortunately, our political space has gotten to the point where America doesn't matter, or at the very least it matters less than them accomplishing their objectives. This was true when they tried to take out Trump in the coup by screaming Russia, and Russia did X or Y. This was true when they didn't want to give Obama his Supreme Court pick, meaning Merrick Garland. This was true, like, meaning it's clear and substantial changes in a political process where the point of view shifted from, yeah, I may not like it, but I'm going to work with the guy because that's my philosophical responsibility to do so. And despite, hating this guy, America matters more. Well, that changed significantly so to my party, my power, that's all that matters. America matters less. And that matters from the standpoint of policy, where Democrats will say, kick rocks, we don't care what you want as a policy or party. That gets to the notion of what the country needs and how both parties and those showboats of a pageants didn't care one iota for it. I'm saying it's to the root of the democracy itself and representative government itself. It is under challenge with a political system that seems to care less about it. And that's a terrifying place for the public to be. And I don't know where that ends up. Or at the very least, that doesn't necessarily give me happy, joyous feelings of where that ends up. Give me joy, Shane.
I think it's always been no, I'm not going to give you joy. I'm going to give you more sadness and misery. But it's always been the case. I mean, the governments throughout history have always oppressed the people within those governments. That's why anarchist literature, for all that I disagree with a lot of its contents, at its nub, it's correct. The state contains violence in the sense that the state enforces violence. The other side of it, though, is that the state also restricts violence. The state contains violence in both senses of that word. It is the capsule that holds that violence inside of itself, and it also keeps people from being too violent to each other, because you have, the legitimization of force, ostensibly at least, until now, when our relationship with policing has become so incredibly fraught. I mean, my point is, civilization has historically always had the problems you're describing. I think we might be a little bit overweened in the States. I think that with the whole, people will talk about the baby boomer generation, but it's not even a generational thing. It is technically, but it's just the economic upsweep that we went through after World War II. We grew up in a bubble, man. Both of us grew up in a bubble. This is how the world works. It's how the world has always worked. What's your take, Jamarl?
The world works the way we demand the world works. I mean, it's not magic. It's it's what is the lowest common denominator that you're willing to accept as a society. That's what you have as a society. And so if we choose for it to work differently, then it works differently. I mean, like I said, these things are acts of policy. I want the world to be a better place. You want the world to be a better place. I know both of us do. Both of us will prefer our political instrument look at the world and say, what are technological solutions, or what do we have at our disposal right now that can fix X problem or Y problem? And how do we just go about and do it? I think both of us are on the same page with that. The catch is always, how do you get there? And unfortunately, or for better or for worse, like you said, we're in a society where it restrains violence while also being the purveyor of that violence. But it has a stick-to-itiveness where it wants to keep itself together. So I agree with you. But all we have right now is policy.
Jamarl, if you're down, we're a minute over. Let's go to a break.
Yeah.
You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be right back, and we're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. But again, Fault Lines, back in a minute.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and we're taking calls. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Jamarl is my co-host. I am Shane. And to 521-1320. We have Trudy calling in from California. Trudy, I was just out in California. How are things there now?
Oh, well, here in Bakersfield, they're not bad. The air is pretty clear.
Good to hear. Yeah, it's been enough, and hopefully the wind blew that stuff away. That's my sense too. Anyway, what were you calling in about, Trudy?
Finally, my same old thing. I want to ask, what message does electing Trump send the Republican Party? We're always talking about not voting Democrat to send the Democrats a message, but the Republicans will consider, if Trump wins, they'll call it a mandate, and they'll do away with the Department of Education, the EPA. They don't allow refugees, which America always took in refugees.
Trudy, let me ask you something. How's it going, Trudy? Let me ask you something. Should the Democratic Party send that message of tanking this election as opposed to appropriating policy that would win this election? I mean, I guess I'm making the point that what message does the Democratic Party send to America if it doesn't appropriate policy that America wants, especially with all of the crises that are afoot?
First, you answer my question, Jamarl. What message does it send to the Republicans if Trump wins?
Republicans, even if Trump wins by one electoral vote and loses by 4 million votes, they would scream mandate and go running out of the Congress, most likely with the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the presidency. It would be a checkmate.
There will be no more abortion, no more...
So what I'm asking you, Trudy, is why... What I'm asking you is, why should the Democratic Party risk that level of an apocalypse? Why should they risk that as opposed to appropriating policies that would energize the base? I mean, it's not mystery, right? I mean, Sanders was able to energize the base. He had all of those Latino voters, people that Biden needs. He had all of the youth vote jazzed up, running out, doing campaign notions. So it's clear, understandable, as a flat fact, what those people want in order to get energized to go out and vote. And Joe Biden wouldn't lose his base. I mean, the people who are out there voting for him right now, he would only gain and energize and invigorate a large number of millions more people.
I understand that they're being stupid, Jamarl. The Democrats are being entirely stupid. They're not playing to the base. But I know they will not outlaw abortion. They will not do away with the Department of Education, the EPA. They will allow in refugees.
No, what I'm asking you is, why is the party, why are you accepting, and why are millions of people accepting that the Democratic Party would risk losing to a man they call the apocalypse, the end of all things, as opposed to backing policy that the American public needs? Like, Trudy, I should not even have to be here making this argument. I mean, for God's sake. I mean, FDR, back during the time, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. He was making that when he was coming in from the Great Depression. It was passing things like Social Security in order, or unionization and those type of things, or expansion of unions, in order to benefit the public that he considered to be at risk. Now, compare that for the moment with a Biden or with the Trump. And ask yourself, if the political party that is running right now in the middle of all of these crises right now is running not with an affirmative message, but is basically risking America itself, as opposed to backing policy that would bring America together, why is it the responsibility of Americans to put Joe Biden in office, as opposed to the responsibility of Joe Biden to go and get those votes and to deal with the real material concerns of this public? Why are you inverting that?
I don't hear you. This might surprise you, but I actually empathize with her and where she's coming from.
I answered a question.
There's a part of me that's also pretty concerned about a second Trump administration too. Yeah, but she asked you a question, and then you turned it on her, and I get it.
I answered her question, and I inverted it because the question should be inverted. To be honest, I mean, it's a quirk of point of view, and whether you deem it more important to get Joe Biden in office as opposed to it is for Joe Biden to get your vote. And I'm making the point from the standpoint of the left, because the left takes that weird position, that juxtaposition where they invert democracy itself and they put it on the public's as if it's their responsibility to get Biden in office as opposed to Biden's responsibility to get their vote. And because of such, we have a country that slid far and fast to the right. I'm saying that needs to stop. I accept that Donald Trump would consider even one electoral vote a mandate. Well, I'm just saying, I accept that Donald Trump would consider anything a mandate. I'm making the point that it is still the responsibility of Joe Biden to get those votes. At the moment that you not accept it that way, you lose any notion of a representative government.
No, I hear you. I understand. I understand where you're coming from. You said this before. I guess, I don't know. We've got other calls. If it's cool, let's just go to them.
Go for it.
Judy calling in from Bakersfield, California. Thank you for the call. Cynthia calling in from Maryland. Cynthia, you're on. What's going on?
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes, we can. Absolutely.
Oh, okay. Yes. Hi. Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. It's my first time on your show. It's very interesting and intriguing conversation. My, I guess, statement more than a question, if that's all right, is that, ever since I started voting as a U.S. citizen, I, as a Black evangelical, have voted Republican. And I'm kind of ashamed to say it was basically based on the litmus test of, are you pro-life, and regarding social issues. And for the very first time this year, I will be voting Democrat. It's like the litmus test went out the window because the Bible says a house divided against itself cannot stand. And the division and the level of incivility, and just rancor and bitterness in this country is toxic, and it's bad for our country and for
Cynthia,
our democracy that a lot of countries look to. And I dare say, if Vice President Biden and Senator Kamala Harris, even spoke on the millions, we may even be in the billions by now, of state taxpayer money that has been paid out because of trigger-happy rogue cops, I'd say they'd win.
Cynthia, cops kill 1,000 people a year. Even under Obama, Black Lives Matter was started under Obama because of the killing. Cops were killing the public itself. This wasn't something that started under Trump. You realize that, right? I mean, this is not a rah-rah Trump. I can't stand Trump. I find him detestable. And this is not me even trying to get you to vote Republican. I guess I'm just pushing back on the notion of that voting Democrat somehow fixes this. I mean, is that what you believe?
Actually, I don't think it's a panacea, but I think that it will at least get us to a place of sanity and civility and restore dignity to political office. I actually voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and I regret it.
Interesting take. Cynthia, we've got two other callers. I want to get to them, but I want to just thank you for calling in. Hope you're having a good time listening into the show for the first time. I believe we were saying you were doing. Anyway, thank you for the call, Cynthia. Ben calling in from Ohio. Ben, you're on the air. What's going on?
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you doing? What's up?
I'm doing all right. I think in response to Jamal's question, my interpretation of it is just because someone is like anti-Trump doesn't mean they're pro-you or pro-America, and that their interests overlap such that they're like basically like on the same team, and you're kind of like choosing between like the Gambino crime family and like the cartels, you know? It's just like, you know, the enemy of your enemy is sometimes just another enemy. But anyway.
Ben, I hear what you're saying generally, but could you give me some specifics? Who are you talking about here?
Oh, well, he was asking, like, if Trump is, like, so apocalyptic, why is it that Democrats aren't doing anything? And I think it's because, you know, like in economics, you know, the concept of promoting adversaries where the rivalry of two different companies or corporations is actually what profits both of them. I think that's sort of what we see here in the political theater, but that's just my interpretation.
And how do you stop that? How do you stop that? Meaning, if it's a Chinese finger trap and you're in this quagmire where you have two political parties that are basically using themselves to prop each other up as a scam, how do you stop that process?
Well, before I answer that, I did have one question before I go to that. So we don't really have a precedent for what would happen in the event of a tie if the Supreme Court is like split down the middle in the event of like an election. In 2000, it was like a 5-4 decision, as an example. And in 2016 and now, in the event that neither one can get up to, I think it's 270 if I'm not mistaken, and we go to the House, but the Supreme Court would have to confirm it. And if you have a situation where, well, we don't have that ninth judge, there would be in a constitutional crisis. So I just think that's interesting. But in regards to your question, I would generally say, like, you know, there is always going to be a transition cost, but you have to sort of accept that just because we may have a system that favors two parties doesn't mean the two parties we have need to be those two parties. Like, there's other things available. So, yeah.
Ben, I think you're absolutely right. We've got another caller, and so I'm kind of cutting you off there, but I think you're right. I think the two parties that, just because even if we're going to have a two-party system, which I don't know that we should accept that, but it doesn't mean that they need to be the Republicans and the Democrats, particularly in their current form. That's why whether we're reforming the parties or you're trying to create an alternative one that sort of, you know, replaces the duopoly. Ideally, we break the duopoly wide open. I think there are plenty of arguments to be made there, but even if we're going to stick with that, it doesn't need to look like it does now. Thank you for the call, Ben. Lou from Missouri. Lou, you've got about 30, 40 seconds. Great calls. What's on your mind?
The inaction of the Democratic Party, it's because the Democratic Party is fundamentally anti-liberation, and it's because they refuse to, you know, think and act along with the people, especially the most powerless among us. And, you know, true liberation and true independence has to come from the practice of, you know, standing diametrically opposed to dominant elites, because they are by nature antithetical to the wants and the needs and the policy needs, especially of the most vulnerable populations. So the Democratic Party, the fact that they tolerate this like crazy dichotomy where people are just merely the only role that people have in our system is to just follow the decisions of these so-called leaders. So it's a constant cycle of dehumanization. So to put it in chess terms, that's just creating asymmetry on the board. Like what a lot of people talk about chess, but a lot of people don't realize that a lot of them end up in just stalemates.
No, I'm going to have to cut you off. I apologize, but we have to go into the break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're coming up with Jim Jatras for a really great conversation on U.S. foreign policy. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and James George Jatras, Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist, also an attorney licensed in D.C. and Pennsylvania. He's appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and has previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. James, is it okay if I call you Jim, first of all?
Jim is fine. Jim, James, whatever you like. It doesn't matter.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Jim. Appreciate it. We're talking about a couple things today. We're talking about, let's start with RBG, I suppose. Ruth Bader Ginsburg recently passed away. Now everything is in chaos, effectively. Democrats are calling for civil war. Legitimately, I saw that happening. And the Republicans are, not exactly jumping the gun, but they're moving pretty quickly. Having said that, in every election year in the past that I've seen where a Supreme Court justice has died, the sitting president has moved to put a new one in place in that same year. If I'm getting that wrong, as far as I can tell, that is the statistic. If I'm getting that wrong, please somebody come and correct me from what I was reading. Research I was doing, that is the case. That's just sort of setting the frame up. It seems like what the Democrats are going to be doing here is a filibuster, at least on this side of the election. But Jim, what's your take? What's going to happen here?
Well, a filibuster won't work, and one of the things both parties each accuse the other of hypocrisy for adopting a position opposite of the one they took in 2016 with Merrick Garland when he was nominated by President Obama. So, fine, yeah, this is politics. Hypocrisy is nothing new for anybody. We keep hearing all the time about the average time for confirmation is about at least 45 days, but there are many, many justices who have been approved in much, much shorter periods of time than that. Some of them, by the way, even on the same day they were nominated. So as far as the filibuster goes, as McConnell likes to point out, the Democrats are the ones that got rid of the so-called filibuster. It's really a cloture rule for judicial nominations back when they had the majority. And he said, okay, fine, you want to do it that way, we'll do it that way. And so he's basically applying that rule now. That doesn't apply to normal legislation, but it does apply to nominations. And that's the lay of the land now. So the Democrats really can't filibuster. The question is, how many Republican defectors will it be?
Right. That's the question. Meaning the Supreme Court, meaning whose seat is up for grabs in the next election and whether those guys need to support Trump or need to lean another way for that. That's the interesting question. Do you think there are going to be enough defectors or do you think that basically Trump, especially in the areas where he needs to be strong for those particular members of Congress that are going to vote on this on his Supreme Court pick, basically he has those votes and that he's going to ram this through regardless of how much the Democratic Party howls about the fact that he's ramming this through?
He very well might. And it really breaks down to the individual senators we're talking about, Collins and Murkowski and Mitt Romney, of course, loathes Trump, what Lindsey Graham or Cory Gardner of Colorado are going to do. We'll see whether they can do that or not. And also it depends on part of who the nominee is. If it's Barrett or if it's LaGoya, obviously it's going to be a woman, as Trump said. It will probably be a Catholic woman. And frankly, I think it's hugely good politics for Trump to have the Democrats engage in an orgy of anti-Catholic bigotry just before an election, because that's a very strong swing constituency. As we know, Barrett in particular has been attacked, partly by Dianne Feinstein, for being a believing Catholic, and that's great politics for Trump.
Wow,
that would be lurid imagery there. By the way, do you think it's going to be a moderate? Who do you think is going to be the pick here, in terms of their political leanings, where they sit on the spectrum?
I think there will be moderate conservatives. I think Barrett and LaGoya, who are the two front runners, reportedly are likely to be. Well, I think it's one of those two. There's another one named Rushing. I think is considered a little more conservative. I don't know what religion is. Theoretically, none of this should matter. Sex, race, religion, none of this should matter when you're appointing somebody to the court. What they're supposed to be is technicians who simply apply the law. But as we know, and of course, this was the heart and center of RBG's tenure on the court, is it's results-based. It's you have an idea of what, quote, justice is, and then you find in the law what it is, the result you want to reach. Judges aren't supposed to do that. They're supposed to just say, I don't care what I feel. I don't care what the Pope says. I don't care anything else. The law says this. It doesn't say that. Well, we left that behind decades ago.
Yeah, and I think her passing made that extremely clear that it was left behind, because the response for RBG's passing has basically been, we're going to fill that court and we're going to put somebody in with our ideology to shift the balance of the court. And all of this, pretending like the court was this kind of non-political body has finally basically went up in smoke. I want to make a hard pivot because I want to talk about foreign policy, especially along the lines of us giving weapons to Taiwan and the response of China in us doing that. Do you think that this is going to set off a certain provocation where there at some point will be some kind of blockade? And the reason why I'm asking this, it's very clear that they are against us giving weapons to Taiwan. It's also very clear that in actions there have been a tit for tat, meaning there hasn't been the situation where the United States will make an action that China considers provocative without having a response. I mean, even with the TikTok deal, they eventually say, yeah, we're not for that. We're not going to go with that. They consider themselves a power. And like people or countries that consider themselves power, they don't necessarily take a backseat to other countries, which sets off an interesting standoff. And my question is, does this standoff take place in the South China Sea, or does it take place in regards to Taiwan and some kind of blockade?
It's a good question, because I don't think anybody knows exactly what's going to happen, but we should keep something in mind that the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait are right off the coast of the United States and vital to our national interest. Oh, wait a minute, that's not true. They're right off China's coast. And it really does beg the question, why are we behaving in such a provocative way, a third of the way across the world in waters that are vital to China's national interests and is vital to their interests, as say the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico are to ours, right, but have absolutely nothing to do with the vital national security of the United States. And this is clearly, I think you have to put this in the context of the way we behave towards Russia as well, in the Black Sea and the Baltic and in Eastern Europe, is that the U.S. policy, when I say U.S. policy, the Trump administration, but basically all of the retread GOP Heritage Foundation warmongers that he's appointed to his administration, despite what he promised in 2016, they have this attitude of pressing Russia and China and lesser powers like Iran and Venezuela and so forth at every possible point, and playing this ridiculous and dangerous game of chicken with these countries over no articulable American national interest. Now, with regard to Taiwan, we recognize that Taiwan is part of China. The only argument historically between Taipei and Beijing is which was the government of all of China. And I think pretty much everybody acknowledges it's Beijing, not Taipei. And even half the people on Taiwan don't want this. The KMT, the traditional nationalist party there, is actually much more pro-Beijing than the ruling DPP, which is the party there now that is playing ball with these provocations. So unfortunately, we have people in the establishment here that look at Taiwan as a convenient platform to provoke and poke at the Chinese to try to get them to respond in a way that would justify harsher sanctions, harsher actions, more meddling in Hong Kong, more meddling in Xinjiang, this unfortunately is just a kind of a full court press campaign of pressure against China as we conduct against Russia and Iran and other countries.
That's very interesting to hear. Briefly, I was not aware of the fact that the KMT, the Kuomintang, is more in support of Beijing than the ruling party in Taiwan. Very interesting to hear, especially, of course, Kuomintang, as far as I can tell, the first party in Taiwan is a distinct state from China. Anyway.
Well, and of course, remember, Taiwan is not a distinct state. It has never claimed to be an independent country.
Interesting. Go into that. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, Taiwan has never declared its independence from China because the whole reason for the existence of a separate administration in Taiwan for many decades under the Kuomintang was that it was the legitimate government of all of China. And they have never renounced that. It's still officially the Republic of China on Taiwan, Taiwan simply being a province of China, but the only one that's not under Communist Party control. And of course, the KMT is a nationalist party, but one that was structured on Leninist lines. The son of Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Ching-kuo, used to be an instructor at the Frunze Military Academy in Moscow. His wife was a Soviet woman. And so they have a very strong, parallel lineage with the Communist Party. And now that the Communist Party of China is not really a Marxist party, it's a Han nationalist party. You have sort of Han national Bolshevism in both the CCP and the KMT. So there's not really much that separates them anymore ideologically.
Beautiful. Thank you for the answer and the correction there, Jim. I appreciate it. Another side of this, talking about the South China Sea, the subject of that dispute specifically seems to be the Spratly Islands. Mm-hmm. It seems like there are other countries involved, though. I mean, as far as I can tell, when we talk about it in the U.S., we paint it in terms of a conflict between China and Taiwan. But Malaysia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, a number of other countries involved there. What do you make of the fact that we don't report that aspect of that situation?
Well, I think all those countries have one thing in common. They ain't us. It was none of those countries are the United States. So why do we have a dog in this fight? If the Vietnamese or the Filipinos or Brunei or everybody else have a disagreement with the Chinese over some rocks in the South China Sea, why is that any of our concern? And the answer you'll get is, well, sea lanes. We have to protect the sea lanes. Well, let's get something straight. There are not huge container ships of American goods going through those waters, selling things to the Chinese. It's the other way around. If the Chinese container ships going to the United States and elsewhere in the world, they're not going to close those sea lanes. What the real purpose of that argument is twofold. One is we make that argument with sea lanes like we do with Huawei and intelligence penetration, not because we're afraid of what the Chinese might do, but because we're afraid that our penetration may be up for grabs, that we can't interdict those sea lanes and cut off people's energy supplies anytime we want, or that we can't spy on somebody's 5G network through our own back doors into those networks. That's the basis of those arguments. The other one is we use those countries' claims as cat paws to, again, poke the Chinese. That when did it become a vital national interest to, say, vindicate the territorial claims of Vietnam? Is Vietnam an ally of the United States? In fact, do we have any real allies that actually help to defend our country? No, it's simply a pretext for us to say, oh, well, look, the Chinese are bad. We're going to back up the Vietnamese. We're going to back up the Filipinos, as though those things matter to the American people and our national security.
And this is both parties, by the way. That needs to be understood at this point. Like,
absolutely.
Even under the Obama administration, these guys were looking at the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Joe Biden will likely go back to that. As this kind of way of cowing China, like cutting off all of this aspect of the world, and doing so and willing to sacrifice all level of basically sovereignty based on some of the provisions that was in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Can you discuss that for a bit? Like, this is like both parties are actively going after China. They're just doing it in different ways.
I think that's correct. The whole idea of the TPP was essentially, I think the phrase that was used by Obama and his people was, well, if we don't write the rules of international commerce, then the Chinese will write the rules. So it was an attempt to try to have a U.S. managed, you might say, a mini WTO that we control in the Western Pacific and along the rim of East Asia. That probably was a non-starter to start with, and then Trump's view was, no, what we're going to do is we'll pull out of that, and then we'll put maximum pressure on China, and then they'll cry uncle and come to the table, and we can dictate terms to them. Look, I think there are a lot of things in our trade relationship with China that are extremely lopsided because so many American corporations have found it very lucrative to dump their American production and their American workers and move their operations over there and then ship things back into the United States essentially duty free. That's not on the Chinese. That's on us. That's on our corporate and governmental leadership who are more than happy to sell out American producers and workers because they can make an extra buck platforming their operations in China or someplace else. And I think that we have to put a stop at that. At the same time, it seems to me there's a natural trade-off that says, look, we will recognize that there is a Chinese sphere of influence in the Western Pacific. Those waters and those neighboring countries are not vital to our interests. They're vital to Chinese interests, just as we've said for 200 years that the Western Hemisphere is vital to our national interests, and we want other powers to stay out. Unfortunately, that's not the thinking we find in either the Republican or Democratic Party. On the one hand, you have maybe the soft control approach we got from the Democrats, which just sort of hug them with all these institutions and networks and webs of influence that will hem them in and control them, whereas the Republican, or at least the Trump approach, is to say, no, we'll pull back and then just pummel them with sanctions and with accusations until they cave in. I don't think either one of those is going to work.
That's the voice of Jim Jatras, Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist. We will be back with Jim in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
We increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that putting in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. Joining us is Jim George Jatras, Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist. He is an attorney licensed with the District of Columbia in Pennsylvania who has appeared before the Supreme Court and has previously served as a U.S. diplomat and a U.S. Senate staffer. I want to get to one last question on China and then pivot into Belarus, because that's another kind of interesting hot point in regards to foreign policy. But how does China view its government, meaning the people of China view its government? And a second piggyback to that question, how are we portrayed? Meaning the United States would have never accepted, we were willing to destroy the world over the Cuban Missile Crisis, meaning Khrushchev had already activated those missiles. Any attack would have basically launched off a nuclear war. And that was for Cuba. But we don't accept the sphere of influence stuff. And again, our perspective of the world is basically we want to be able to control it all. We want to prevent any new powers to emerge. So how does the Chinese government itself view this? Because I would imagine they have to have gamed this out to some degree in regards to defense of self and getting across information to the population. I hope that question makes sense. I'm trying to get a feel for what's going on in the heads of the people who are over there in regards to our actions in the world.
Well, the short answer is with regard to how the broad mass of the population in China looks at their government and looks at us, I really can't say. It's not like I've looked over the polling data, and I don't know if reliable polling data for that thing really exists. I think there's a general sense that people in China, remember the Han are the largest ethnos, the largest distinct ethnic group on the planet, and we're the largest group of people who see themselves all as one nation. So that's something you don't sneeze at. I mean, in terms of people who are conscious of themselves and of their identity and their culture and their 5,000-year-old history and all that sort of thing, that's something I think you have to take into account. And now whether they believe that the Communist Chinese Party is actually a good steward of that, if they're sticking up for their national interests, or whether they're all just feathering their own nests through various, state-owned enterprises and things like that. I'm sure there's some of that as well, all of which gets back to what I said about the South China Sea, is they ain't us. The internal affairs of China and how they run their country are not really our business. We can have our opinions, we can criticize them, but there's certainly not a reason for us to pressure them and risk war with them over something like democracy, human rights, and all that free market stuff that we are fed as a kind of a propaganda line, which in my opinion is largely just a cover for an oligarchy that exists in this country as well, politically and economically. So it's mote in your neighbor's eye and the beam in your own eye, all that sort of thing. I think the bigger problem is the one you put your finger on, though, is that we want to control the whole world. Look, when I worked at the Soviet desk at the State Department years ago, and then later at the Senate, I had this kind of naive view during the first Cold War that when communism ended, we could go back to kind of a normal, non-ideological world like pre-1914. It really didn't occur to me that we would now become, in a sense, the kind of new ideological power, like a new Soviet Union that had our own progressive ideology we had to impose on the whole planet with either bribes or with bombs and sanctions. And unfortunately, that's what we've been doing since the wall came down in 1991. That's why we have to collect every country in Europe in NATO. That's why we want to form a new Arab NATO in the Middle East. We want a new Indo-Pac NATO with India and Australia and Japan to pressure the Chinese, is that there's not a square inch of the planet that the establishment in Washington does not think it should have the final word on. And that's an extremely dangerous thing because it essentially denies sovereignty every other country on the planet.
Well, you're talking about ideology. This is something we complain about frequently, almost constantly on the show. The idea that we become unhinged from any sort of moral grounding. With the Soviet Union, you had ostensibly a competition between liberal democracy and communism, socialism, Marxism, whatever. With the decline of the Soviet Union in the fall, there are vestiges of that left, of course, most notably in China, major power in the world. But at the same time, it seems that we've lost our way. And like a magnetized compass, if you lose your magnetic North Pole, your compass stops working. And I think that we've lost our way. What's taken the place of those ideological convictions, what's sort of given them new life and vigor, even as it's adopted, their corpse in a weird way, wearing it like a mask. Looking at authoritarianism we've set ourselves up as the liberal democratic bastion of freedom against authoritarian governments abroad. Most notably, at least recently in the last couple of weeks, a flashpoint in between Russia and the EU in Belarus. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, last I heard, the opposition leader, was actually calling for the EU not just to condemn the elections, but also to actively get involved. That would be effectively a coup. What do you think is going to happen next there, Jim?
I think the short answer is it's not succeeding. Tikhanovskaya has been recognized by Lithuania as the real president of Belarus, kind of like we've all recognized Juan Guaido as the real president of Venezuela. Who cares what people in Venezuela say? I don't think this is going to work in Belarus. I think this attempt at a color revolution, and I think it is a color revolution of the type we've done in so many countries, and frankly, we're kind of seeing here in the United States as well. That I think it's going to fail, and what I think that's going to backfire. That what the upshot is that Lukashenko has been playing footsie with the West for several years now, trying to have his cake and eat it too, kind of like Yanukovych tried to do in Ukraine before 2014. And the idea that he can play the Americans and the Europeans off against the Russians, whom he can count on because they've got no place else to go. I think he's now put himself in a position now where he entirely relies on the Russians, and they see that he is a bit of a liability. I think they will ease him out and make much more progress toward the so-called Union State that was signed between Belarus and the Russian Federation several years ago, that the Russians have no choice now but to move faster with incorporating Belarus, not necessarily into the Russian Federation as a formality, but de facto as part of Russia.
Interesting. So you're saying that basically, in order to deal with the issue of Belarus, that it's just going to bring it into the Russian sphere of influence in a formal way, not necessarily in kind of a
I think it's been in the Russian sphere of influence. It's been in the Russian sphere of influence, and this was an attempt, like we saw in Ukraine and frankly in Georgia in 2008, to bring it into the Western sphere of influence, and even to drag it into NATO. Remember, the Bucharest Declaration from 2008 that Georgia and Ukraine will be members of NATO is still on the books. That's still formal Western policy, and this is a direct threat to the national security of Russia in the same way that our pulling around the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits is to China, and not to mention Xinjiang and Hong Kong. So it's I think the Russians are, they're going to play their cards carefully as they have in the past. But I think the people who thought they could pick this pawn off the other side of the board, and put it on our side of the board, I think they made a mistake.
I think you're probably right. Yeah, the Union State, we've talked about that before on the air. I'm curious, what do you think the timeline would be for that?
I think it'll take several years, and I think it will be a kind of a slow motion thing. And as I say, I don't think it will necessarily mean a formal joining of Belarus to the Russian Federation. The Union State is kind of an odd concept. It's kind of a federal arrangement between two sovereign entities, but one that's supposed to have a common currency, a common capital, which I think would be Minsk. Actually, I don't know exactly how it's going to work out, but I think that the Russians feel, I think correctly, that this is a door open, that's a vulnerability that they can't afford to leave open any longer.
Wow, that's
fascinating.
fascinating.
You see the possibility of another Euromaidan type event? I mean, say that Lukashenko, not Lukashenko. Yes, say that Lukashenko, I'm getting confused. I admit I'm a little bit out of my depth dealing with juggling Ukrainian names. I was thinking Yanukovych for a second, but of course Lukashenko from Belarus, like you're saying. If Lukashenko gets pushed out of power, if this is US-backed, if you see another Euromaidan-style incident in Belarus, and then, as you did in Crimea, in the east of Ukraine, you see certain people wanting to join up with Russia. Do you see that as a potential flashpoint, or is that just me pattern matching? What's your take?
I don't think we would see a replay of Ukraine. In other words, you don't have quite the same east-west divisions in Belarus that you have in Ukraine, and you don't have as large of a base of anti-Russian feeling in Belarus as you did in Ukraine, or at least in western and central Ukraine. So I don't think there will be a split there. I don't think the opposition has the ground game in Belarus as they did in Ukraine to mount that kind of an effort. And if they did, unlike Yanukovych, who dithered back and forth about whether or how much force to use to oppose it, and of course it cost him his presidency, I think that the Russians will back up either Lukashenko or whoever else is really in charge at that point to do whatever they need to restore order. And if the Western countries don't like it, they impose sanctions, well, too bad.
Wow. So just 30 seconds. Basically, you don't see this going anywhere. You basically see Lukashenko's or the Belarusian government joining Russia in order to prevent this kind of predatory NATO and trying to create any kind of division within the country.
Either Lukashenko or somebody else that the Russians find amenable, and and again, I don't know if it will actually join Russia, but I don't think the effort to break it off and add it to our network of satrapies around Russia is going to succeed.
I see.
Jim, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate the commentary, valuable perspective, bringing it to us. Benighted Morals. For those listening, that was Jim Jotras, Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist. He is an attorney licensed in the District of Columbia and Pennsylvania who has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and has previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. And, as everybody just heard, incredibly knowledgeable, informed, and I think I'd love to have you back on. Again, thank you for being with us. Everybody listening, this is the end of the Tuesday edition, today's edition of Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back tomorrow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a beautiful, brilliant, great day.
And guys, that was Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thank you all for joining us again for another great show. Yes, I argue with lefties when they come on the show about that stuff because I think it's a big deal. I don't think capitulation in a moment where you've basically won the argument makes sense. And I understand that that's something that has taken place for the last 40 years. But it's taken place over the last 40 years because they've been basically able to conceal the fact that policy-wise you win the argument. And so it's irritating for me for lefties to take that cowed position of, laying down basically and not standing up for policy, because basically Margaret Kimberler is right. If you want anything accomplished, if you want anything to change, anything different, you got to walk. And you got to be able to stand out there under the guise of policy, under the guidelines of policy, and say, you get our vote and you represent our interests. And honestly be somewhat indignant about it. I mean, you are the American public after all, and you're the American public that has to deal with the indignity of a government that doesn't do its fucking job. And so, there's that. But until you do that, what does accountability look like in a political space? I tell you what it doesn't look like. Giving your vote away for somebody who doesn't represent your interests. And again, like I said, that's the opposite of politics. Bob Ramirez, Trump will say no more globalist neoliberalism. Oh, Trump when says no more globalist neoliberalism. Trudy, if refusing to vote Democrat is to teach them a lesson, what does it tell Republicans if they win? If Republicans win, anti-abortion, they outlaw abortion, protects and publics education. Yes. Trudy, I think it's worse. I think if Republicans win, they take the House. I think they take the Senate. I think they add members onto the Supreme Court. And yes, of course, they have the presidency. It is a checkmate across the board. Now, your question is to the Democratic Party. Why would you risk that? If it is very clear that backing Medicare for all with 88% support or 70% support from the standpoint of the general public, or elimination of student debt, or creation of free public schools, if those things are popular with the American public, and doing those things is the thing that brings energy and enthusiasm to your party in order for you to win, then not doing those things is at that point a Democratic Party that is basically willing to capitulate and toss it over the cliff into a man they're calling the apocalypse. My question to you is, why are you okay with a party that is willing to do that? And it's not your issue, not the voters. Those voters would love to vote for somebody that would represent their interests. Their issue is the party that doesn't do that and is scamming you in the way that these two parties are leaning on one another in order to get your vote without actually representing your interests. It's a scam. The scam has to stop. Your issue is with the party, not with voters. Ramona Lawson, when mainstream media pundits tout rule of law, what they're actually saying is that we the hoe, what they're actually saying, we the hoe, politics need to remember our place at the bottom is to be ruled by those favoring the elites. Look, if 30 million people, let's say all Bernie voters, say, we want Medicare for all, period. Each one gets up there, says the same thing, drops the mic, walks out the door. And one voter after the next picks up the mic, says the same thing, drops it, walks out the door. Meaning, this is what the public needs. You have a pandemic, and you are trying to do it on the cheap and not even acknowledging the fact that this is taking place. We're done. We're not accepting this. In the same way that a union will say we're done when a company exploits them to the hilt. The party and members of the party, especially the left, needs to do the same. Now, point out the left because your party basically has the elites and the poor, or let's say the workers. And the workers have something that is in their interest. They want higher wages, they want benefits, they want health care, they want security in regards to the way they operate, do their jobs, etc. And you have a wealthy class that doesn't want those things. For the last 40 years, you basically had a rich running the roost and getting everybody else to go along with it because they were going to be least worse. The contradiction is built into the party itself. I'm making the point that that needs to change, and the only way to change is if you leave and you make it clear that you are not willing to accept what they've typically been giving you, because it's the rational position to take. I mean, for fuck's sake, why would you take a position in the middle of a pandemic where all of these people are going to be ill, all of these people, many of which are not going to have health care, and you still would say, okay, I'll still vote for the guy because I'm so terrified of the Republican? It is his job to get your vote, not the other way around. And we are not in a campaign time where you think your policies are unpopular. You won the policy argument, which needed some courage. And courage to be willing to say it is their job to get our vote, not the other way around. And it is an inversion of democracy itself. And yeah, that is not something that the public should be on board for. And if it means that Joe Biden loses, then the Democratic Party should have done something different in the way they ran their campaign. Like, share.